The wind howled through the gaps in the cabin walls like the voices of the damned, carrying with it the bitter promise of another sleepless night. Joyce Mitchell pressed her back against the rough-hewn door, her breath forming small clouds in the frigid air as she listened to the heavy footsteps moving across the floor above. Each creak of the wooden planks sent a shiver through her that had nothing to do with the cold. She had been here 3 weeks now, longer than any cook had lasted in Kenneth Bailey's employ during the harsh mountain winters. The others had fled before the first serious snowfall, taking their wages and their warnings with them. But Joyce had nowhere to run. The small mining camp of Cedar Ridge, nestled deep in the Colorado Rockies, represented her last chance at survival, and the imposing figure of Kenneth Bailey was the only thing standing between her and the unforgiving wilderness. The footsteps stopped directly overhead. Joyce held her breath, counting the seconds until they resumed their restless pacing. She had learned his patterns in these 3 weeks, the way he moved through the house like a caged wolf, never settling, never at peace, during the day he disappeared into the mine shafts that honeycombed the mountain, returning each evening covered in dirt and exhaustion, his dark eyes holding a wariness that spoke of secrets buried deeper than any ore. The other men in camp whispered about him when they thought she could not hear. They spoke of the cooks who had come before her, how each had arrived full of hope and determination, only to pack their belongings in the dead of night and disappear down the mountain trail. Some said it was his temper that drove them away. Others claimed it was something darker, something about the way he watched people, as if measuring their worth against some invisible scale. Joyce pulled her thin shawl tighter around her shoulders and moved away from the door. The kitchen, if it could be called that, consisted of a cast-iron stove, a rough wooden table, and shelves lined with tin cans and sacks of flour. Everything was functional, utilitarian, stripped of any comfort or warmth beyond what was absolutely necessary for survival. Like the man who owned it. She had arrived in Cedar Ridge on the last supply wagon before winter closed the passes, carrying nothing but a battered suitcase and a letter of recommendation from her previous employer. The letter was a lie, of course. Martha Morgan had never worked as a cook in a respectable household in Denver. She had scrubbed floors in a boarding house until the owner's son had cornered her in the cellar one too many times, and she had been forced to choose between her virtue and her employment. The name Joyce Mitchell was borrowed from a gravestone she had seen in the cemetery outside town, a young woman who had died of consumption before she could live long enough to need employment. It seemed fitting somehow, this borrowing of a dead woman's identity. Joyce felt dead herself most days, hollowed out by loss and disappointment until only the shell remained. Before we see how this ends, tell us where you are watching from and hype this video in the comments. The sound of Kenneth's boots on the stairs brought her back to the present. She quickly moved to the stove, stirring the pot of stew that had been simmering since late afternoon. The meat was tough, the vegetables sparse, but it was hot and filling, which was all that mattered in a place like this. Kenneth appeared in the doorway, his massive frame filling the space between the kitchen and the main room. He was not a handsome man by conventional standards. His face was weathered and scarred, marked by years of hard labor and harder living. His hair, dark as coal dust, hung past his collar, and his beard covered most of his jaw. But it was his eyes that drew attention, pale blue and penetrating, as if they could see straight through to a person's soul. He said nothing, merely nodded toward the table. This was their routine. Joyce would serve his meal, and he would eat in silence while she cleaned the dishes and prepared for the next day. Sometimes he would leave money on the table for supplies. Sometimes he would simply disappear upstairs, leaving her to wonder if she had somehow filled in her duties. Tonight felt different, though. There was a tension in the air, a charge like the moments before a lightning strike. Joyce ladled the stew into a chipped ceramic bowl and set it before him, along with a thick slice of bread she had baked that morning. Kenneth picked up his spoon but did not begin eating. Instead, he studied her face with those unsettling eyes. He said finally, his voice low and rough from disuse. Joyce's hand trembled as she reached for the empty pot. "I do not know what you mean, sir. The others, they were frightened of me. You should be frightened too." He took a spoonful of stew, chewed thoughtfully. "But you are not. You are frightened of something else entirely." She turned away, busying herself with scrubbing the pot clean. The water in the basin was cold, but she barely noticed. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she tried to think of a response that would not give her away entirely. "I am grateful for the work," she said carefully. "I have no reason to fear you." Kenneth's laugh was bitter, without humor. Quote 6. Joyce glanced over her shoulder at him. He had stopped eating and was staring into the bowl as if it contained answers to questions he had never asked aloud. Quote 7. She asked, surprising herself with her boldness. Quote 8. He pushed the bowl away, only half finished. Quote 9. The admission hung in the air between them like smoke. Joyce had heard whispers about Kenneth's wife, how she had died during the previous winter under circumstances that no one seemed willing to discuss in detail. Some said it was the influenza that had swept through the camp. Others hinted at something more sinister. "I am sorry for your loss," Joyce said and meant it. She knew the weight of grief, how it could settle into a person's bones and never quite leave. Kenneth stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the wooden floor. Quote 11, and he said. Quote Dawood. Joyce set down the pot and turned to face him fully. There was no point in maintaining the pretense any longer. He had seen through her lies as easily as looking through glass. Quote oil, she said simply. Quote Byerton. Something shifted in Kenneth's expression, a crack in the armor he wore so carefully. For just a moment, Joyce glimpsed the man beneath the reputation, lonely and damaged, and trying to make sense of a world that had taken everything he valued. "What are you running from?" he asked. The question was quiet, almost gentle, but it hit Joyce like a physical blow. She thought of the boarding house, of hands that grabbed and voices that threatened, of the choice she had made to preserve what little dignity she had left. She thought of the long journey west, sleeping in wagon beds and eating scraps, always looking over her shoulder for pursuit that never came. "The same thing most women run from," she said finally. "Men who believe they have the right to take what they want." Kenneth nodded slowly as if this answer made perfect sense to him. He moved toward the stairs, then paused with his foot on the first step. "The others left because they could not stand the isolation," he said without turning around. "Winter here is not like winter in the cities. It gets into your mind, makes you think things, see things that are not there. Are you prepared for that?" Joyce looked around the sparse kitchen, at the walls that would soon be her prison, when the snow began to fall in earnest. She thought of the alternative, of returning to Denver and the life she had fled, and felt her resolve harden like iron in a forge. "I am prepared," she said. Kenneth climbed the stairs without another word, leaving Joyce alone with the dying fire and the sound of wind that seemed to carry voices from another world. She finished cleaning the dishes and banked the coals for the night, then sat at the table with a cup of weak tea and tried not to think about the long winter ahead. Outside, the first snow of the season began to fall. The next morning brought 6 inches of fresh powder and the arrival of Zachary Nelson, the camp's supply coordinator. Joyce heard his horse before she saw him, the animal's hooves muffled by the snow, but still audible in the crisp morning air. She was in the root cellar taking inventory of their stores when Kenneth's voice carried down from above. "What do I quote to?" Zachary's voice was younger, lighter than Kenneth's, with the easy confidence of a man who had never known real hardship. At 23. Joyce climbed the ladder from the cellar, emerging into the kitchen to find both men standing near the stove. Zachary was perhaps 30, with sandy hair and a clean-shaven face that spoke of regular meals and comfortable living. His clothes were well-made, his boots expensive. He looked like what he was, a man who profited from other men's labor without getting his own hands dirty. "Mrs. Mitchell," Kenneth said, acknowledging her presence without looking in her direction. "This is Zachary Nelson. He coordinates supplies for the mining operation." Zachary's eyes swept over Joyce with the practiced assessment of a man accustomed to evaluating women like livestock. She felt her skin crawl under his gaze, but kept her expression neutral. Quote 26. Zachary said, his smile too wide and too familiar. Quote 28. Joyce replied with a slight nod. Quote Freudian, Zachary said, settling himself at the table as if he owned the place. Quote Joyce busied herself with the coffee pot, but her ears were attuned to every word. Sen. News from the outside world was rare in Cedar Ridge, and often carried implications that went far beyond mere gossip. Zachary continued, accepting the cup Joyce offered him. Quote 33. Joyce's hand trembled slightly as she poured Kenneth's coffee, but she managed to keep her expression unchanged. Kenneth, however, was watching her closely, those pale eyes missing nothing. Kenneth said. Zachary agreed. The coffee pot felt suddenly heavy in Joyce's hands. She set it down carefully and moved to the window, ostensibly to check the weather, but actually to hide her face from both men. Did he say what crimes these missing persons were suspected of? Kenneth asked, his tone carefully neutral. Nothing specific, but the impression I got was that they were not the criminals, if you understand my meaning. More likely they were witnesses to something, or victims who had escaped something unpleasant. Joyce stared out at the falling snow, watching the flakes dance and swirl in the wind. Behind her, she could hear the soft clink of ceramic as the men drank their coffee, the scrape of chair legs against the floor. The normal sounds of a normal morning, except that nothing about this morning felt normal anymore. Interesting, Kenneth said finally. I suppose we should all be careful about the company we keep. There was something in his tone that made Joyce turn around. Kenneth was still watching her, but there was no suspicion in his gaze, no threat. If anything, he looked almost protective, like a man preparing to defend something he valued. Zachary finished his coffee and stood, pulling on his heavy coat. I should be getting back before the weather worsens. Kenneth, I will need your ore samples by the end of the week if you want them included in the next shipment to Denver. They will be ready, Kenneth replied. And Mrs. Mitchell, Zachary turned his attention to Joyce, that predatory smile returning to his face. If you ever tire of the isolation up here, there are always opportunities in town for a woman of your talents. The insult was subtle but unmistakable. Joyce felt heat rise in her cheeks, but before she could respond, Kenneth was on his feet, moving between her and Zachary with the fluid grace of a man accustomed to violence. Mrs. Mitchell's employment arrangements are not your concern, Kenneth said, his voice low and dangerous. I suggest you focus on your own responsibilities. For a moment, the two men faced each other in silence, and Joyce could feel the tension crackling between them like electricity. Zachary was younger and probably faster, but Kenneth had the advantage of size and, more importantly, the kind of controlled fury that came from having nothing left to lose. Of course, Zachary said finally, his smile never wavering, but his eyes growing cold. I meant no offense, simply making conversation. He left without another word, the sound of his horse's hooves quickly swallowed by the falling snow. Kenneth remained standing by the window, watching until Zachary disappeared down the mountain trail. Kenneth said quietly, Joyce asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Quote 52. Kenneth turned from the window to face her directly. Quote 53. Joyce thought of the way Zachary had looked at her, the casual cruelty in his suggestion about opportunities in town. She thought of the marshal asking questions about missing persons, and the life she had fled in Denver that seemed to be catching up with her, despite the miles and the false name. She said, Kenneth replied, quote 56. The words should have been frightening, but Joyce found them oddly comforting. She had been running for so long that the idea of being trapped, of having no choice but to stand and face whatever came, felt almost like relief, she said. Kenneth studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. He said, the snow continued to fall throughout the day, and by evening it was clear that winter had arrived in earnest. Joyce stood at the kitchen window, watching the white curtain that had descended over the world, transforming the familiar landscape into something alien and beautiful. The mine entrance, usually visible from the house, had disappeared entirely behind the veil of falling snow. Kenneth had not returned from the shafts, which was unusual. Typically, he was back by late afternoon, but the sun was setting now, and there was still no sign of him. Joyce tried to tell herself that he was simply waiting out the worst of the storm in one of the mine buildings, but an uneasy feeling had settled in her stomach. She prepared dinner as usual, keeping the stew warm on the stove and the bread wrapped in cloth to stay fresh. The wind had picked up, rattling the windows and sending occasional puffs of smoke back down the chimney. Each gust made the house creak and sway slightly, a reminder of how fragile their shelter really was against the forces of nature. As full darkness fell, Joyce lit the oil lamps and tried to settle herself with mending. Her hands were steady as she worked, but her mind kept drifting to Kenneth's words about being on their own once the passes closed. She had wanted isolation, had craved the safety of distance from civilization, But now that it was upon her, she realized how completely vulnerable they would be. The sound of the door opening brought her head up sharply. Kenneth stamped his feet on the threshold, shaking snow from his coat and hat. His face was grim, his usual weariness replaced by something that looked like concern. "The storm is worse than expected," he said without preamble. "I had to secure the mine entrances to prevent cave-ins. We may be cut off from the main shafts for several days." Joyce set down her mending and moved to the stove. "Are you hurt?" "No." Kenneth hung his coat on a peg near the door and moved closer to the fire. "But we have another problem. I found tracks near the lower shaft, fresh ones made since the snow started." "What kind of tracks?" Joyce asked, though she dreaded the answer. "Human. Someone was watching the mine, staying hidden in the trees. They left when the storm got worse, but they will be back." Joyce felt her blood turn cold. "Zachary?" "Possibly, or someone working for him." Kenneth accepted the bowl of stew she offered him, but did not immediately begin eating. "There are things about this mining operation that you do not understand, Mrs. Mitchell. Things that make it valuable to certain people." "What kind of things?" Kenneth was quiet for so long that Joyce thought he would not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "The ore we extract here is not just copper and silver. There are other minerals, rarer ones that certain government contracts require, the kind that men kill for." The admission hung between them like a physical presence. Joyce sank into the chair across from him, her mind racing through the implications. "Your wife," she said slowly. "Did she know about this?" Kenneth's face went rigid, the muscles in his jaw tightening visibly. "Gotta hear." The words were spoken so matter-of-factly that it took Joyce a moment to process their meaning. When she did, she felt as if the floor had dropped out from under her. Kenneth finally took a spoonful of stew, chewing mechanically. Kenneth's eyes met hers across the table, and Joyce saw a pain there so deep it made her heart ache. "She died in this house, in our bed, while I was working late in the mines. By the time I found her, it was too late." Joyce reached across the table instinctively, covering his hand with hers. His skin was cold, roughened by years of hard work, but she could feel the tremor that ran through him at her touch. "I am sorry," she said, and meant it more than she had ever meant anything in her life. Kenneth stared down at their joined hands for a moment, then gently pulled away. "Sorry will not bring her back, and it will not protect you if Zachary decides you know too much as well." "What are you saying?" "I am saying that you should leave, tomorrow, if the storm breaks. Take what money I owe you and go somewhere far from here. Somewhere Zachary Nelson will never think to look." Joyce felt something fierce and unexpected rise in her chest. "No." "Mrs. Mitchell, no." She stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "I told you before I have nowhere else to go, and I will not be driven away by threats and intimidation." Kenneth looked up at her, surprise flickering across his features. "You do not understand what you are risking." "I understand perfectly. You think I am some fragile flower who will wilt at the first sign of danger." Joyce moved to the window, staring out into the swirling snow. "You are wrong. I have faced worse than Zachary Nelson, and I have survived. This is different. Sarah was strong too, and look what happened to her." Joyce turned back to face him, her chin raised defiantly. "Then we will have to make sure we are stronger than she was, smarter, more careful." Kenneth studied her for a long moment, and Joyce could see him weighing her words, measuring her resolve against the dangers they faced. Finally, he nodded slowly. "If you are determined to stay, then we need to prepare. Zachary will not wait long to make his move, especially if he suspects you might know something about the mining operation." "What do you need me to do?" "First, we secure the house. There are rifles in the upstairs bedroom, ammunition in the chest by the window. Do you know how to shoot?" Joyce thought of the pistol she had carried on her journey west, the weight of it in her hand and the way it had felt to point it at a man who meant her harm. "Yes." "Good. Second, we need to establish signals, ways to communicate if we become separated. And third," Kenneth's expression grew grim, quote now on. The question hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that Joyce was not sure she was ready to face. But as she looked at Kenneth, at the pain and determination in his eyes, She realized that her answer had been decided the moment she chose to stay. Quote 100, she said quietly. Kenneth nodded, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. They spent the next hour preparing for what Kenneth grimly referred to as a siege. The rifles were cleaned and loaded, positioned at strategic points throughout the house where they could be quickly accessed. Joyce learned the locations of spare ammunition, emergency supplies, and the hidden cache of money that Kenneth kept for emergencies. Kenneth said as he showed her the loose floorboard where the money was hidden. Quote 103, quote armed, Joyce said firmly. Quote armed. Kenneth straightened, his back creaking slightly from the unaccustomed bending. Quote Washington. Joyce waited, sensing that this revelation was important in ways she did not yet understand. Quote Washington, Kenneth said slowly. Quote none. Quote Juan, Kenneth's laugh was bitter. Because Zachary's influence extends far beyond this mountain. The territorial marshal, the mining commissioner, even some of the federal representatives, they are all in his pocket. Taking the evidence to them would be like signing my own death warrant. Joyce felt pieces of a puzzle clicking into place in her mind. But if the evidence were to reach the right people, people outside of Zachary's influence, it could destroy him, yes, but getting it to those people would require leaving the mountain, and I cannot do that without abandoning everything I have worked for here. What if you did not have to leave? Kenneth looked at her sharply. What do you mean? Joyce moved to the window, her mind racing as she watched the snow continue to fall. An idea was forming, dangerous and uncertain, but possibly their only chance. Zachary thinks I am just another cook, another woman to be intimidated or bought off. He does not know about my past, about the skills I learned before I came here. What skills? Joyce turned back to face him, her decision made. I was not entirely truthful about my previous employment, Mr. Bailey. Before I worked in the boarding house, I was employed by a lawyer in Denver, a man who specialized in cases involving government corruption. I know how to handle documents, how to make copies, how to get information to the right people without being detected. Kenneth stared at her for a long moment, and Joyce could see him reassessing everything he thought he knew about her. You are saying you could get the evidence out without either of us having to leave the mountain? I am saying I could try, but it would be dangerous, and it would require perfect timing. Kenneth was quiet for several minutes, weighing the risks and possibilities. Outside, the storm continued to rage, but Joyce felt a strange calm settling over her. For the first time since arriving in Cedar Ridge, she felt like she had a purpose beyond mere survival. There is something else, Kenneth said finally. Something I have not told you about Sarah's death. Joyce waited, her heart hammering against her ribs. She was pregnant when she died, 3 months along. We had been trying for years, and finally, his voice broke slightly, and he had to clear his throat before continuing. Zachary did not just kill my wife. He killed my child as well. The revelation hit Joyce like a physical blow. She sank into the nearest chair, overwhelmed by the depth of Kenneth's loss and the magnitude of Zachary's crimes. I am so sorry, she whispered. I have been living with that knowledge for 8 months, Kenneth continued, his voice steady now, but hollow. Living with the fact that I could not protect them, could not even prove what really happened. But if there is a chance, even a small one, to make Zachary pay for what he did, there is, Joyce said firmly. We will make him pay. Kenneth looked at her, and for the first time since she had known him, Joyce saw something other than pain and wariness in his eyes. She saw hope. It will not be easy, he warned. Zachary is clever, and he has resources we can only dream of. If we make a mistake, if we tip our hand too early, then we will not make mistakes, Joyce said simply, and we will not tip our hand. The wind howled around the house, rattling the windows and sending snow spiraling past the glass in hypnotic patterns. Joyce found herself thinking of the woman she had been when she arrived in Cedar Ridge, frightened and desperate, and running from a past she could not escape. That woman felt like a stranger now, someone weak and helpless who no longer existed. When the storm breaks, Kenneth said, Zachary will likely come back, probably with men to help him. He will want to search the house, to see if there is anything here that could threaten him. Let him come, Joyce said, surprised by the steel in her own voice. By the time he realizes what we are really planning, It will be too late. Kenneth smiled then, the first genuine smile she had seen from him, and Joyce felt something warm and unexpected bloom in her chest. It was not love, not yet, but it was the beginning of something deeper than mere alliance. It was partnership, forged in the crucible of shared danger and mutual trust. "We should get some rest," Kenneth said, rising from his chair. "Tomorrow we begin planning in earnest." Joyce nodded, but as Kenneth moved toward the stairs, she called out to stop him. "Kenneth," he turned back, eyebrows raised. "Thank you for trusting me with this, for giving me a chance to be part of something that matters." Kenneth studied her face for a moment, then nodded slowly. "Thank you for staying, for not running when things became difficult." He disappeared up the stairs, leaving Joyce alone with the dying fire and the sound of the storm. She sat for a long time, staring into the glowing coals and thinking about the path that had brought her to this moment. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new dangers, but for the first time in months, Joyce Mitchell felt truly alive. Outside, the snow continued to fall, sealing them away from the world and all its threats. But inside the small cabin, two people who had lost everything were beginning to discover that sometimes the end of one story was really the beginning of another. The storm raged for 3 more days, trapping them in a world of white silence broken only by the howling wind and the occasional crack of a tree branch giving way under the weight of accumulated snow. Joyce and Kenneth used the time to refine their plans, going over every detail until they could recite their strategy like a well-rehearsed play. Kenneth showed her the hidden entrance to the mine shaft where the documents were stored, a narrow passage concealed behind a rockfall that appeared natural but had been carefully constructed. The evidence was sealed in waterproof containers and hidden deep enough that even a thorough search would be unlikely to uncover it. "Sarah and I spent months gathering this information," Kenneth explained as they crouched in the narrow tunnel, their breath visible in the frigid air. "Financial records, correspondence, even testimony from miners who had been threatened into silence. It is enough to destroy Zachary and his entire operation, if it reaches the right people." Joyce studied the containers, her mind already working through the logistics of copying and transmitting the most crucial documents. "How many people know about this hiding place?" "Just you and me now that Sarah is gone. Even she never came down here herself. The passages are too narrow and dangerous for someone unfamiliar with them." They emerged from the mine into the pale afternoon light, both of them covered in rock dust and breathing hard from the exertion. The snow had finally stopped falling, but the world remained locked in winter's grip, every surface transformed by the pristine white blanket that stretched as far as the eye could see. Quote 146, Joyce said, surprising herself with the observation. Kenneth followed her gaze across the transformed landscape. Quote 147, quote 114, quote 14, Kenneth's expression grew distant. "My father died in a mine collapse in Pennsylvania when I was 12. Spent his whole life working for other men, making them rich, while his own family struggled to put food on the table. When I found this place, when I realized what it could become, I swore that no one would ever take it away from me." Joyce nodded, understanding more than Kenneth probably realized. She too had spent her life at the mercy of others, dependent on their whims and subject to their cruelties. The idea of having something that was truly her own, something worth fighting for, resonated in her bones. "What will you do when this is over?" she asked. "When Zachary is gone and the mine is truly yours?" Kenneth was quiet for a long moment, his pale eyes scanning the horizon as if looking for answers in the distant peaks. "I have not thought that far ahead," he admitted. "For so long, everything has been about survival, about getting through each day without losing what little I have left. Perhaps it is time to start thinking about something more than just survival." Their eyes met, and Joyce felt that spark of connection again, stronger now than it had been before. There was an understanding between them that went beyond words, a recognition of shared strength and shared purpose that made her feel less alone than she had in years. The sound of horses approaching broke the moment. Both of them turned toward the trail, where 3 riders were emerging from the tree line, their mounts struggling through the deep snow. Even at a distance, Joyce could recognize Zachary Nelson's confident posture and expensive coat. Kenneth observed grimly. Joyce counted the riders, noting the way they spread out as they approached, positioning themselves to cover multiple escape routes. These were not casual visitors or mining associates. These were men who knew how to handle trouble. Quote 157, Kenneth asked quietly. Joyce thought of everything they had planned, all the careful preparations and contingencies they had discussed. She thought of Sarah Bailey, dead in her bed while carrying the child she had longed for. She thought of her own journey to this place, all the running and hiding and compromising that had brought her to this moment of decision. Quote 158, she said and meant it with every fiber of her being. They walked back to the house together, their footsteps crunching in the snow, while behind them, the three riders continued their steady approach. Joyce could feel Kenneth's tension, the coiled energy of a man preparing for battle, but she also sensed his confidence in their plan and in her ability to execute her part of it. As they reached the porch, Joyce paused to look back at the approaching riders. Zachary had raised his hand in what might have been a greeting or might have been a signal to his companions. Either way, the gesture struck Joyce as presumptuous, the action of a man who believed he held all the advantages. He was about to learn how wrong he was. Kenneth held the door open for her and Joyce stepped inside, her mind already shifting into the role she would need to play. Behind them, the sound of hoofbeats grew louder, and somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled its lonely song into the crystalline air. The confrontation they had been preparing for was finally at hand. The three riders dismounted near the porch, their horses snorting and stamping in the deep snow. Joyce watched from the kitchen window as Zachary Nelson brushed snow from his expensive coat and gestured to his companions. The two men with him were strangers to her, but their bearing spoke of violence barely held in check. One was tall and lean, with the weathered face of a man who spent his life outdoors. The other was shorter but broader, with hands that rested too casually near the pistol at his hip. Kenneth moved beside her at the window, his presence solid and reassuring. The tall one is Jeffrey Sanchez, he said quietly. He works for the Territorial Mining Commission, but his real loyalty is to whoever pays him best. The other is Kevin Phillips. He calls himself a security consultant, but he is really just hired muscle. Joyce nodded, filing away the information. She had expected Zachary to bring help, but seeing these men in person made the danger feel immediate and real. There would be no reasoning with them, no appeal to their better nature. They were here to do a job, and they would do it regardless of the bomb. Remember, Kenneth said, his voice barely above a whisper, you are just the cook. You know nothing about the mine beyond what any servant would observe. Let me handle the talking. A heavy knock echoed through the house. Kenneth straightened his shoulders and moved toward the door, every line of his body radiating controlled tension. Joyce remained by the window, her hands folded in front of her in what she hoped appeared to be nervous submission. Kenneth opened the door, and cold air rushed into the warm kitchen along with the three visitors. Zachary stepped inside first, his smile as false and predatory as Joyce remembered. His pale eyes swept the room, cataloging every detail with the thoroughness of a man searching for weakness. Kenneth, my friend, Zachary said, his voice carrying the forced joviality of a snake oil salesman. I hope you do not mind the intrusion. The storm delayed our planned visit. Zachary. Kenneth's greeting was neutral, neither welcoming nor hostile. Zachary's gaze shifted to Joyce, and she felt his attention like a physical weight. Mrs. Mitchell, is it not? I trust you are settling in well despite the harsh conditions. Yes, sir, Joyce replied, keeping her voice soft and deferential. Mr. Bailey has been most generous in his employment. Jeffrey Sanchez moved deeper into the room, his sharp eyes taking in every corner and shadow. This is quite an isolated location, he observed, his accent carrying traces of Spanish heritage. Easy for things to go missing without anyone noticing. Nothing goes missing from my operation, Kenneth said, his tone hardening slightly. I run a careful business. Kevin Phillips remained near the door, his hand resting openly on his gun now. The gesture was casual but unmistakable in its meaning. Joyce forced herself to remain calm, though her heart was racing. These men had not come for a social visit or routine business discussion. They were here for something specific, and they were prepared to use violence to get it. Of course you do, Zachary said smoothly, but recent events have made certain parties nervous. There have been rumors, whispers about documents and evidence that could be damaging to legitimate business interests. Kenneth's expression remained carefully neutral. Quote 177, Mom. Quote 178. The mention of Sarah caused Kenneth's jaw to tighten almost imperceptibly. Joyce saw the flash of pain and rage that crossed his features before he regained control. She wanted to reach out to him, to offer some gesture of support, but she knew that would only draw unwanted attention. Sarah kept household records, Kenneth said carefully. Nothing more. Jeffrey Sanchez had wandered to the base of the stairs, his head tilted as if listening for something. Mind if we have a look around, just to satisfy our concerns about security? It was not really a question. Kevin Phillips stepped away from the door, blocking any exit, while Zachary continued to smile his predatory smile. Joyce felt the walls of the small house closing in around them, the careful plans she and Kenneth had made suddenly feeling fragile and inadequate. I suppose that would be acceptable, Kenneth said after a moment, though I am not sure what you expect of Pindain. Oh, probably nothing at all, Zachary replied, but due diligence requires that we be thorough. Jeffrey Sanchez was already climbing the stairs, his boots heavy on the wooden steps. Joyce listened to him moving around in the rooms above, opening drawers and closets, searching for something that would give Zachary the leverage he needed. She knew he would find nothing there, but the violation still made her skin crawl. Mrs. Mitchell, Zachary said suddenly, turning his full attention to her. How are you finding the work here? I imagine it must be quite different from your previous employment. Joyce felt the trap in the question, the way Zachary was probing for inconsistencies in her story. It is honest work, she said simply. I am grateful for the opportunity. Yes, but where did you work before coming here? I am always interested in hearing about the experiences of working women in our territory. Kenneth shifted slightly, moving closer to Joyce in what could have been interpreted as either protection or intimidation. Mrs. Mitchell's previous employment is not relevant to our current arrangement, he said. Of course not, Zachary agreed. I am simply making conversation. Though I must say there is something familiar about you, Mrs. Mitchell. Have we met before? Joyce forced herself to meet his gaze directly, drawing on every ounce of acting ability she possessed. I do not believe so, sir. I would certainly remember. Zachary studied her for a long moment, his pale eyes searching her face for something she could not identify. Finally, he nodded slowly. Perhaps I am mistaken, though I pride myself on remembering faces, especially attractive ones. The compliment felt like a threat, and Joyce had to resist the urge to step backward. Instead, she lowered her eyes in what she hoped appeared to be modest embarrassment. You are very kind, sir. Jeffrey Sanchez's footsteps overhead had moved to what Joyce knew was Kenneth's bedroom. She heard the sound of furniture being moved, drawers being pulled out completely, the systematic destruction of privacy that came with a thorough search. Kenneth's hands were clenched into fists at his sides, but his face remained impassive. Kenneth observed. Zachary replied. Kevin Phillips spoke for the first time, his voice rough and gravelly. Kitwatern Kutawanan came the reply from upstairs. Kutatwantuhun. Joyce felt a small measure of relief. They had anticipated this search and moved anything potentially incriminating to the hidden cache in the mine. But she knew the real test was yet to come. If Zachary suspected that evidence existed, he would not be satisfied with searching just the house. Code 203. Zachary said to Kenneth, settling himself at the kitchen table as if he owned the place. Quote 204. Kenneth moved to the stove, ostensibly to check on the coffee pot, but really to put some distance between himself and their unwelcome visitors. Zachary nodded thoughtfully. Quote 200. There was something in his tone that made Joyce look up sharply. Zachary was watching Kenneth with the intensity of a cat studying a mouse, as if waiting for some reaction that would confirm his suspicions. Quote 209, Kenneth said. Quote 209, quoted him. The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Joyce felt her blood turn cold as she realized what Zachary was implying. If Kenneth did not cooperate, if he did not hand over whatever evidence Zachary believed existed, then a mining accident could be arranged, just as Sarah's death had been arranged to look like natural causes. Jeffrey Sanchez's footsteps were moving toward the stairs now. Joyce heard him pause at the top, then begin his descent. When he appeared in the kitchen doorway, his expression was frustrated. "Quote to 12," he reported. "Quote to Baron, quote to Toferntum?" Zachary asked. "Quote to Tofantum?" Zachary's smile never wavered, but Joyce could see the calculation behind his eyes. He had expected to find something in the house, some evidence that would give him immediate leverage over Kenneth. The fact that his search had come up empty meant he would have to try a different approach. "Well," Zachary said, rising from his chair with fluid grace, "I suppose we should take a look at the mining operation itself. After all, that is where the real business is conducted." Kenneth's face went very still. "Quote 28, quote 218th," Zachary replied. Quote 200, quote 10. Zachary's voice carried a mocking edge now, the pretense of civility beginning to slip. "But I think we will take our chances." Joyce watched this exchange with growing alarm. If Zachary and his men searched the mine thoroughly enough, they might discover the hidden passage where the evidence was stored. Kenneth had assured her that the entrance was well concealed, but these men were professionals. They knew how to find things that people wanted to keep hidden. "Perhaps I could prepare some food for your journey back to town," Joyce offered, hoping to delay their departure for the mine. "The trail will be difficult in this snow." Zachary turned to her with renewed interest. "How considerate. But we are not planning to leave today, Mrs. Mitchell. In fact, I think we may need to stay the night, just to make sure we have time for a proper inspection." The words hit Joyce like a physical blow. If these men stayed overnight, if they had hours to search and probe and ask questions, the carefully maintained facade would inevitably crack. Worse, they would be trapped in the house with three dangerous men, completely cut off from any possibility of help or escape. "I'm afraid our accommodations are quite limited," Kenneth said. "We do not have facilities for guests." "Oh, I am sure we can make do," Zachary replied. "Kevin can sleep in the main room, Jeffrey can take the kitchen, and I will be comfortable enough upstairs. Mrs. Mitchell can continue with her usual arrangements, whatever those might be." Joyce felt heat rise in her cheeks at the implication, but she forced herself to remain silent. Any protest would only draw more attention to her situation and potentially expose the careful lies they had constructed. "That is settled then," Zachary continued. "Now shall we take that tour of the mining operation?" Kenneth looked at Joyce and she saw the conflict in his eyes. He did not want to leave her alone with these men, but refusing to show them the mine would only increase their suspicions. After a moment, he nodded slowly. "Very well, but you will follow my instructions exactly. One wrong step in those tunnels could kill us all." "Naturally," Zachary agreed. "We are all reasonable men here." The four men left the house together, their voices fading as they made their way toward the mine entrance. Joyce watched from the window until they disappeared behind a stand of snow-laden pines, then sank into the nearest chair with shaking legs. She was alone now, truly alone for the first time since the men had arrived. The house felt different without Kenneth's reassuring presence, smaller and more vulnerable. Every creak of the settling timbers made her jump. Every whisper of wind against the windows sounded like approaching footsteps. Joyce forced herself to stand and move to the stove, where she began preparing the evening meal with mechanical precision. Cooking was familiar, comforting, a routine that helped calm her racing thoughts. But even as her hands went through the familiar motions of cutting vegetables and seasoning meat, her mind was racing through possibilities and contingencies. If Zachary found the hidden cache, Kenneth would be in immediate danger. The men would not hesitate to use violence to extract information about who else might know about the evidence or where copies might be hidden. And once they had what they wanted, they would eliminate both Kenneth and herself to prevent any future problems. But if the cache remained hidden, if Kenneth could convince them that no evidence existed, then they might leave in the morning and return to whatever schemes occupied their time in town. It was a slim hope, but it was all they had. Joyce was stirring the stew when she heard the sound of horses approaching again. Her heart leaped into her throat as she rushed to the window, expecting to see Zachary and his men returning early from their inspection. Instead, she saw a single rider picking his way carefully through the snow-covered trail. The newcomer was a stranger to her, a middle-aged man with graying hair and the weathered face of someone who spent his life outdoors. He wore the star of a territorial marshal on his heavy coat, and his horse bore the marks of hard travel through difficult conditions. Joyce felt a surge of hope followed immediately by terror. If this was the marshal Zachary had mentioned, The one who had been asking questions about missing persons? Then perhaps help had finally arrived. But if the marshal was also in Zachary's pocket, as Kenneth suspected, then his presence would only make their situation more desperate. The marshal dismounted and tied his horse to the porch rail, then climbed the steps with the careful deliberation of a man who had learned not to take unnecessary risks. His knock was firm but not aggressive, the sound of someone accustomed to having doors open for him. Joyce smoothed her apron and tried to compose her features into an expression of mild curiosity rather than desperate hope. When she opened the door, the marshal touched the brim of his hat politely. "Ma'am, I am Marshal Jeffrey Davis with the Territorial Government. I am looking for Kenneth Bailey." "Mr. Bailey is not here at the moment," Joyce replied, stepping back to allow him entrance. "He is showing some visitors around the mining operation." "May I ask what this concerns?" Marshal Davis entered the warm kitchen and removed his hat, revealing hair that was more gray than brown and eyes that missed very little. "I am investigating some irregularities in mining claims and business practices in this area. Nothing that Mr. Bailey is suspected of, you understand, but his operation has been mentioned in connection with some larger concerns." Joyce felt her pulse quicken. This could be the break they had been hoping for, a legitimate authority figure who might be willing to listen to their evidence. But she had to be careful. If she revealed too much too quickly, and the marshal turned out to be compromised, she would be signing their death warrants. "I see," she said carefully. "I am just the cook here, Marshal. I do not know much about the business side of things." "Of course, and you are?" "Joyce Mitchell." The marshal studied her face with the same intensity Zachary had shown, but his attention felt different, more professional and less predatory. "Mitchell, have you been working here long, Mrs. Mitchell?" "Since late fall. Mr. Bailey needed help with the household duties before winter set in." "And before that?" Joyce hesitated, weighing her options. The truth was dangerous, but lies could be equally perilous if the marshal had ways of checking her story. "I worked in Denver," she said finally, "for a lawyer who specialized in territorial law." The marshal's eyebrows rose slightly. Quote, Joyce chose the name carefully. Thornton had been a real person, a lawyer who had handled cases involving government corruption until his untimely death in a carriage accident 6 months earlier. If the marshal checked, he would find records of Thornton's practice, but no way to verify whether Joyce had actually worked for him. "I knew Richard Thornton," Marshal Davis said slowly. "A good man. His death was a great loss to the legal community." Joyce nodded, hoping her expression conveyed appropriate sadness rather than relief at having chosen her lie well. "He was a fair employer. I was sorry to lose the position when he died." "I imagine you learned quite a bit about territorial law working for him." "Some. Mostly I handled correspondence and filing, but Mr. Thornton believed in educating his staff about the work we were supporting." Marshal Davis settled himself at the table, accepting the cup of coffee Joyce offered him. "Then you might understand the importance of proper documentation in business dealings, particularly those involving government contracts." Joyce felt her heart begin to race again. The marshal was leading somewhere specific with this conversation, probing for something that suggested he might already know more than he was revealing. "Documentation is certainly important," she agreed. "Mr. Thornton always said that the truth could only be established through proper records." "Wise words. Tell me, Mrs. Mitchell, in your time here, have you observed anything unusual about Mr. Bailey's operation? Visitors who seemed out of place, conversations that struck you as odd, anything that might suggest irregularities?" Joyce pretended to consider the question carefully while her mind raced through the implications. This was the moment of decision, the point where she had to choose between safety and justice, between protecting herself and potentially saving Kenneth. "There have been some visitors," she said slowly, "men who seemed more interested in asking questions than conducting normal business." "What kinds of questions?" "About records, about what Mr. Bailey might have kept from his wife's time here. She died last winter, and they seemed to think she might have left behind documents of some kind." Marshal Davis leaned forward slightly, his interest clearly piqued. "These visitors, did they identify themselves?" "One of them is here now, actually. Mr. Zachary Nelson. He brought 2 other men with him this morning." The marshal's expression darkened. Quote 266, quote 267, Marshal Davis stood abruptly. his hand moving then instinctively toward the gun at his hip. Quote to 68. Joyce felt the world tilt around her. A federal investigation meant that Kenneth had been wrong about the extent of Zachary's influence. There were people in authority who were not in his pocket, people who might actually be able to act on the evidence hidden in the mine. What kind of evidence, she asked, though she already knew the answer. Documents, correspondence, financial records that could prove his illegal dealings with government contractors. We have been building a case against him for months, but we need solid proof to make charges stick. Joyce made her decision. Marshall, there is something you need to know, something that could be exactly what you are looking for. Before she could continue, the sound of voices carried across the snow from the direction of the mine. Marshall Davis moved quickly to the window, peering out at the approaching figures. They are coming back, he said grimly. Mrs. Mitchell, whatever you were about to tell me will have to wait. Right now, I need you to act as if we have been having a normal conversation about routine matters. Can you do that? Joyce nodded, though her heart was hammering so hard she was sure it must be visible. What are you going to do? My job, the marshal replied, but I may need your help before this is over. The voices were getting closer now, and Joyce could make out Kenneth's deeper tones among the others. She busied herself at the stove, trying to appear as if she had been cooking all along, while Marshall Davis resumed his seat at the table and adopted a relaxed posture that belied the tension she could see in his shoulders. The door opened, and Kenneth entered first, followed closely by Zachary and his two companions. Kenneth's face was carefully neutral, but Joyce could see the strain around his eyes. Behind him, Zachary looked frustrated and suspicious, while Jeffrey Sanchez and Kevin Phillips wore the expressions of men who had spent an unproductive hour in cold, dangerous conditions. Marshall Davis, Zachary said, his voice carefully controlled, but carrying an undercurrent of alarm. What brings you to Cedar Ridge? Routine inquiries, Mr. Nelson, the marshal replied easily. I was in the area investigating some mining claim disputes and thought I would check on Mr. Bailey's operation while I was here. How convenient that we should all arrive on the same day, Zachary observed. Indeed, though I understand you gentlemen have been conducting your own inspection. Find anything interesting? Joyce watched the interplay between the two men, the careful verbal fencing that revealed far more than either was willing to state directly. Zachary knew that the marshal's presence was not coincidental, just as the marshal clearly understood that Zachary's visit to the mine was not routine business. Nothing out of the ordinary, Jeffrey Sanchez answered when Zachary remained silent. Mr. Bailey runs a clean operation. I am sure he does, Marshal Davis replied. Mr. Bailey has always struck me as an honest businessman. Kenneth moved to stand beside Joyce, his presence offering comfort and strength. Marshal, will you be staying for dinner? Mrs. Mitchell has prepared more than enough. That is very kind, but I should be getting back to town before the weather worsens, the marshal replied, though perhaps I could speak with you privately for a moment before I go. Zachary's eyes narrowed. Marshal Davis said smoothly, quote 292. The tension in the room was palpable now, a charged atmosphere that reminded Joyce of the moments before a thunderstorm. Everyone was being carefully polite, but she could feel the undercurrents of suspicion and threat flowing between the various factions. Quote 293. Zachary said after a moment of quote 294. Marshal Davis nodded agreeably, but Joyce caught the slight tightening around his eyes that suggested he was not fooled by Zachary's sudden desire for cooperation. Certainly, though I suspect my questions are quite routine and would bore most people. Oh, I doubt that, Kevin Phillips spoke up, his hand resting casually on his gun again. We find law enforcement work fascinating. The threat was subtle but clear. If Marshal Davis tried to speak with Kenneth privately, if he attempted to gather information that Zachary did not want shared, then violence was a distinct possibility. Joyce felt the walls closing in around them again, the careful balance of power shifting in ways that could prove deadly. In that case, Marshal Davis said, rising from his chair with deliberate slowness, perhaps we should step outside where we can speak more freely. The fresh air might do us all good. Joyce knew this was a mistake the moment the words left the marshal's mouth. Outside, away from the relative safety of the house, Zachary's men would have more options for dealing with an inconvenient law enforcement officer. But she also understood that Marshall Davis was trying to create an opportunity for Kenneth to share information without putting Joyce in immediate danger. An excellent idea, Zachary agreed, his smile returning with predatory intensity. Jeffrey, Kevin, why do you not join us? I am sure you would find the Marshall's questions educational. The five men moved toward the door, leaving Joyce alone in the kitchen with her racing thoughts and growing terror. Through the window, she could see them forming a loose circle in the snow-covered yard, their breath creating small clouds in the frigid air. The conversation appeared casual from a distance, but Joyce could see the tension in every posture, the way hands hovered near weapons and eyes constantly shifted to assess threats and opportunities. She moved closer to the window, straining to hear fragments of conversation carried on the wind. Marshall Davis was asking questions about mining claims and territorial regulations, while Zachary provided smooth, evasive answers that revealed nothing of substance. Kenneth stood slightly apart from the others, his attention divided between the Marshall and Zachary's men. Then something changed. Joyce saw Marshall Davis straighten suddenly, his hand moving toward his gun. At the same moment, Kevin Phillips stepped backward, creating space for a clear draw. The casual conversation had become a confrontation in the space of a heartbeat. Joyce could not hear the words, but she could see the escalation in body language and positioning. Jeffrey Sanchez had moved to flank the Marshal while Kevin Phillips faced him directly. Zachary stood back, watching the scene unfold with the detached interest of a man who had orchestrated many such moments. Kenneth was caught in the middle, too far from the house to reach safety, but close enough to be caught in any crossfire that might erupt. Joyce saw him glance toward the kitchen window, and their eyes met for just an instant. In that brief connection, she saw everything he could not say aloud: the apology for bringing her into this danger, and the desperate hope that she might somehow survive what was about to happen. The standoff stretched for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds. Then Marshall Davis made his move, his hand closing on his gun as he stepped backward toward his horse. But Jeffrey Sanchez was faster, his own weapon clearing leather with practiced speed. The first gunshot shattered the winter silence like breaking glass. Joyce screamed as she saw Marshall Davis stagger, dark blood spreading across the snow at his feet. But the Marshal was not finished. Even wounded, he managed to draw his own weapon and return fire, the shot taking Jeffrey Sanchez in the shoulder and spinning him around. Kenneth dove for cover behind a stack of firewood as Kevin Phillips opened fire, bullets splintering the wood around him. Zachary had pulled his own gun now, a small but deadly pistol that glinted in the pale winter light. Joyce knew she had to act. The evidence hidden in the mine was worthless if everyone who knew about it was dead. More importantly, she could not stand by and watch Kenneth be murdered in his own yard by men who had already taken so much from him. She ran to the cabinet where Kenneth had shown her the spare rifle, her hands shaking as she checked to make sure it was loaded. The weapon was heavier than she remembered, but the weight felt reassuring in her hands as she moved back to the window. Outside, the battle was chaotic and desperate. Marshall Davis had taken cover behind his horse, but the animal was panicking, rearing and plunging in terror. Kenneth was pinned down behind the woodpile, unable to move without exposing himself to fire from multiple directions. Joyce took careful aim through the window glass, choosing her target with deliberate precision. Kevin Phillips was the most immediate threat to Kenneth, his position allowing him a clear line of fire to the woodpile. Joyce drew a deep breath, held it, and squeezed the trigger. The window exploded outward in a shower of glass and splinters. Kevin Phillips spun around, clutching his leg where Joyce's bullet had found its mark. The distraction gave Kenneth the opportunity he needed to move, rolling from behind the woodpile to a better position near the porch. Zachary's attention snapped to the broken window, his pale eyes finding Joyce through the jagged opening. For a moment, their gazes locked, and she saw recognition dawn in his expression. He knew now that she was not just an innocent cook caught in the crossfire. She was an active participant in whatever resistance Kenneth had been mounting against his schemes. Quote 302. Zachary shouted to his remaining men. Quote 303. Jeffrey Sanchez, despite his wounded shoulder, began moving toward the house. Joyce knew she had perhaps seconds before he reached the door, seconds to make a decision that would determine whether she lived or died. She could run. The back door led to a path that wound through the trees toward the lower mine workings, In the confusion of the gunfight, she might be able to escape and hide until help arrived, or the situation resolved itself. It was the sensible choice, the safe choice. Instead, Joyce reloaded the rifle and took aim again. Her second shot caught Jeffrey Sanchez in the chest, dropping him face first into the snow. The man lay still, dark blood spreading around his body like spilled ink. Joyce felt a moment of sickness at what she had done, but it passed quickly. These men had come here to commit murder. She was simply defending herself in the man who had given her shelter when she had nowhere else to go. Kevin Phillips was still mobile despite his leg wound, using his rifle to keep Kenneth pinned down while Zachary moved to a position where he could cover the house. Marshall Davis had managed to reload his pistol, but his movements were growing sluggish from blood loss. Joyce knew they were running out of time. Even if they managed to survive this immediate confrontation, more of Zachary's men might arrive. And if word got back to town that a territorial marshal had been killed at Kenneth's mine, the official response would be swift and overwhelming. She left the rifle by the broken window and moved quickly through the house to the back door. The path to the mine was treacherous in the snow, but she had walked it enough times to navigate by memory. What she was planning was dangerous, possibly suicidal, but it might be their only chance. The hidden entrance to the evidence cache was concealed behind what appeared to be a natural rockfall near the main mine shaft. Joyce had to clear away snow and loose stones before she could access the narrow opening, her hands growing numb from cold and exertion. Behind her, she could still hear the sporadic crack of gunfire as the battle continued in the yard. The passage was even narrower than she remembered, barely wide enough for her shoulders. Joyce had to crawl on her hands and knees, feeling her way through the darkness toward the chamber where Kenneth had hidden the documents. The air was stale and cold, heavy with the smell of damp earth and old timber. When she finally reached the cache, Joyce worked by feel alone, her fingers identifying the waterproof containers by their shape and weight. She selected the one Kenneth had told her contained the most damaging evidence, the documents that could definitively link Zachary to government corruption and Sarah Bailey's murder. The journey back through the passage seemed to take forever. Joyce could feel panic rising in her throat as she imagined what might be happening outside. Whether Kenneth was still alive, whether Marshall Davis had succumbed to his wounds. But she forced herself to move carefully, knowing that a mistake in the narrow tunnel could trap her underground while the people she cared about died above. When she finally emerged from the mine, the gunfire had stopped. Joyce crouched behind a boulder, straining to see what had happened in the yard. The silence was somehow more terrifying than the shooting had been, pregnant with possibilities she did not want to contemplate. Then she heard Kenneth's voice, strained but alive, calling out from somewhere near the house. Quote 304. Quote 305, came Zachary's reply from a different position, is what your wife tried to steal from me. The documents she copied, the evidence she thought she could use to destroy everything I have built. Sarah is dead, Kenneth said, pain evident in his voice. Whatever she had died with her. I do not think so. I think you have been sitting on that evidence all winter, trying to decide what to do with it. But you are not a killer, Kenneth. You do not have the stomach for what real justice requires. Joyce clutched the document container to her chest, knowing that she held the key to everything Zachary feared. But how could she use it? Marshall Davis was wounded, possibly dying. Kenneth was outnumbered and outgunned. Even if she managed to get the evidence to the proper authorities, it might be too late to save the people who mattered most to her. Then she remembered something Marshall Davis had said about building a case against Zachary for months. If there was already an investigation underway, if other law enforcement officers knew where the marshal had gone, then help might already be on the way. Joyce made her decision. Instead of trying to rejoin the fight directly, she would take the evidence and try to reach the main trail. If she could flag down any travelers, or better yet encounter a search party looking for the missing marshal, she might be able to bring help before it was too late. But first, she had to make sure Kenneth knew what she was doing. If he thought she had simply fled, he might give up hope and surrender to Zachary's demands. Joyce worked her way through the trees toward the house, staying low and moving carefully to avoid detection. When she was close enough to the yard to see clearly, her heart sank. Marshall Davis was lying motionless in the snow. Whether dead or unconscious, she could not tell. Kenneth had taken shelter behind the porch, But his position was precarious. Kevin Phillips, despite his wounded leg, had found a spot where he could keep Kenneth pinned down while Zachary maneuvered for a killing shot. Quote 3:20, Zachary called out, his voice carrying easily across the snow. Quote 3:11, Joyce felt ice form in her veins. Somehow Zachary knew she had not fled. Perhaps he had seen movement in the trees, or perhaps he was simply gambling that she cared too much about Kenneth to abandon him. Either way, her presence was now being used as leverage against the man who had protected her. Kenneth replied, but Joyce could hear the defeat creeping into his voice. Quote the three warrior, the words hit Joyce like a physical blow. If Zachary had somehow discovered her true identity, if he knew about her connection to the lawyer in Denver and the skills she had acquired there, then the careful facade they had maintained was completely shattered. Quote 3:4, Zachary began counting. Joyce looked at the document and container in her hands, then at Kenneth's position behind the porch. She could try to reach him, to give him the evidence before making her escape attempt. But that would expose both of them to gunfire, and there was no guarantee that Kenneth would be able to use the documents any more effectively than she could. 2. Or she could create a distraction, something that would give Kenneth a chance to reach better cover or even to turn the tables on his attackers. But what kind of distraction could she create that would not simply result in her own death? 3. Joyce remembered the dynamite Kenneth had mentioned keeping for mining operations, stored in a shed near the main shaft. If she could reach it, if she could create enough of an explosion to panic Zachary's remaining men, it might give Kenneth the opportunity he needed. Quote 317. But the shed was on the far side of the yard, completely exposed to gunfire from multiple directions. Joyce would never reach it alive, and even if she did, she had no experience with explosives. She was more likely to kill herself than to help Kenneth. Quote 318. Joyce closed her eyes, trying to think of something, anything that might change the balance of power in their favor. When she opened them again, she saw movement near Marshall Davis's still form. The lawman was not dead after all, but was slowly, carefully reaching for something in his coat. 6. Whatever Marshall Davis was doing, Joyce realized she had to buy him time. If the marshal could get back into the fight, if he could distract Zachary's men for even a few seconds, it might be enough to tip the scales. Quote 3:12. Joyce stood up from her hiding place among the trees, the document container held high above her head. Quote 3:21. She called out, her voice carrying clearly across the snow. Quote 3:22. The counting stopped. Joyce could feel every eye in the yard focused on her as she stepped out from the tree line, the waterproof container visible in her raised hands. Zachary's pale eyes were fixed on the documents with an intensity that made her skin crawl, while Kenneth's face showed a mixture of relief at seeing her alive and terror at her exposure to danger. Quote 3:23. Zachary said, his voice carrying false warmth. Quote 3:24. Quote RT, Joyce said, taking another step into the open. Quote 3:26. Zachary's smile widened, but his gun remained trained on Kenneth's position. Quote 3:27. Joyce could see Marshall Davis moving slightly behind his horse, his hands slowly working toward whatever he had been reaching for in his coat. She needed to keep Zachary's attention focused on her, to give the wounded lawman time to prepare whatever desperate gambit he was planning. I know what these documents contain, Joyce continued, taking another step forward. Financial records, correspondence with government contractors, evidence of bribes and illegal mining claims. Enough to destroy your entire operation. And enough to see you and Kenneth hanged as accessories if the wrong people get hold of them, Zachary replied. You see, Mrs. Mitchell, the beauty of corruption is that it implicates everyone it touches. Even the innocent become guilty by association. Kenneth shifted slightly behind the porch, and Joyce saw Kevin Phillips adjust his aim to track the movement. The wounded man was pale from blood loss, but his hands were steady on his rifle. One wrong move from Kenneth, and the confrontation would end in bloodshed. What do you want? Joyce asked, though she already knew the answer. I want those documents destroyed naturally, along with anyone who might have read them or copied them or shared their contents with unauthorized parties. Zachary's tone was conversational, as if he were discussing the weather rather than multiple murders. Quote Quote, friend, Joyce felt something cold and hard settle in her stomach. Zachary was not planning to let any of them live, regardless of whether she surrendered the documents or not. This entire negotiation was simply a way for him to position his remaining man for clean shots at all three of them. Joyce said quietly. Quote to Brennan. Before Zachary could react, Joyce hurled the document container as hard as she could toward the mine shaft, sending it tumbling through the air in a high arc. Zachary's eyes followed the trajectory instinctively. His attention diverted for just a moment from the people he was holding at gunpoint. That moment was all Marshall Davis needed. The lawman rolled out from behind his horse, a small derringer clutched in his hand. The single shot took Kevin Phillips in the chest, dropping him backward into the snow with a wet thud. Kenneth moved at the same instant, diving from behind the porch toward the fallen Jeffrey Sanchez's rifle. Zachary spun back toward him, his pistol tracking the movement, but Joyce was already running. She crashed into Zachary from the side, her momentum carrying both of them to the ground in a tangle of limbs and snow. Zachary was stronger than she was, but Joyce had desperation on her side. She clawed at his gun hand, trying to prevent him from bringing the weapon to bear, while Kenneth scrambled for the rifle. Zachary cursed and tried to throw her off, his free hand grabbing for her throat. Joyce felt his fingers close around her windpipe and knew she had only seconds before he choked her unconscious. She drove her knee upward as hard as she could, connecting with Zachary's ribs and forcing a grunt of pain from his lips. His grip loosened slightly, enough for her to twist away and grab for his gun. The pistol went off between them, the shot muffled by their struggling bodies. For a moment, Joyce thought she had been hit, but then she realized that the wetness spreading across her coat was Zachary's blood, not her own. The bullet had taken him in the side, a serious wound but not immediately fatal. Kenneth reached them just as Zachary managed to tear the gun from Joyce's grasp. The mining man's boot connected with Zachary's wrist, sending the pistol spinning away across the snow. Then Kenneth's hands were around Zachary's throat, 8 months of grief and rage finally finding their outlet. Kenneth, no, Joyce gasped, struggling to her feet. We need him alive. We need him to confess. Kenneth's hands tightened for a moment, and Joyce could see the temptation in his eyes, the desire to end this once and for all with this simple violence. But then he loosened his grip, allowing Zachary to breathe while keeping him pinned to the ground. Kenneth said, his voice raw with emotion. Quote 342. Zachary coughed, blood speckling his lips. Quote 343. He wheezed. Quote Barnda and quote Sharon. Marshall Davis said, limping over to join them. Quote Vatsu. The lawman was pale from blood loss, but his eyes were alert and focused. In his hand, he held a small device that Joyce did not immediately recognize. She asked. Marshall Davis replied. Zachary's face went white as the implication sank in. That will never hold up in court. No judge will accept such evidence. Perhaps not in a territorial court, Marshall Davis agreed, but federal judges are more progressive in their thinking, and this case is definitely going to federal court. Joyce retrieved the document container from where it had landed near the mine shaft, checking to make sure the waterproof seal had not been damaged. The evidence was intact, ready to be combined with the marshal's recording to build an unshakable case against Zachary and his entire operation. Quote 353. Joyce said to Marshall Davis, noting how much blood he had lost. Quote 354, the marshal replied. Quote 355. Kenneth helped Zachary to his feet, keeping a firm grip on the wounded man's arms. What about the bodies? Joyce looked at the still forms of Jeffrey Sanchez and Kevin Phillips, their blood dark against the white snow. She felt no remorse for their deaths, but she understood that there would be legal consequences to address. Self-defense, Marshall Davis said firmly. They opened fire on a federal officer. Everything that happened after that was justified. As they moved toward the house, Joyce found herself walking beside Kenneth, their shoulders touching in a gesture of mutual support. The immediate danger was over, but she knew that the real work was just beginning. There would be investigations, trials, testimony that would drag the events of this day into the light for all to see. What will happen now? She asked quietly. Kenneth looked down at her, his pale eyes softer than she had ever seen them. Now we rebuild. We take back what was stolen, and we make something better from what remains. And us? The question slipped out before Joyce could stop it, revealing more of her feelings than she had intended. Kenneth's hand found hers, their fingers intertwining naturally. Get to him. Joyce squeezed his hand, feeling the calluses and scars that told the story of his hard life. Code 363. Behind them, Marshall Davis was explaining to Zachary his rights under territorial law, the formal words that would begin the legal process of bringing him to justice. But Joyce was not listening to the legal proceedings. Instead, she was looking ahead to the house where she had found refuge, to the mind that would soon be free of Zachary's corruption, to the future that was finally beginning to take shape. The snow had stopped falling, and pale winter sunlight was breaking through the clouds for the first time in days. It felt like a sign, a promise that the long darkness was finally coming to an end. 3 hours later, the yard looked like the aftermath of a battle, which Joyce supposed it was. Marshall Davis had used Kenneth's horse to ride down the mountain trail, carrying word of what had happened and summoning additional law enforcement officers. Zachary sat tied to a chair in the kitchen, his wound bandaged but his future decidedly grim. Joyce moved between the stove and the table, preparing food for what would likely be a long night. More marshals would arrive by morning, along with territorial officials and probably federal investigators. The small cabin that had been her refuge would become the center of a legal storm that might rage for months. Code 364. Zachary said, breaking the silence that had settled over the room. Despite his circumstances, his voice still carried traces of the arrogance that had defined him. Quote 365. Kendon had looked up from the legal documents he was reviewing, papers that Marshall Davis had left behind to help prepare for the coming investigations. Quote 366, where are you? Quote 367. Joyce set a cup of coffee in front of Kenneth, her hand briefly touching his shoulder. Quote 368. Zachary's laugh was bitter. Justice, Sarah Bailey was a foolish woman who did not understand the realities of territorial politics. She thought she could expose corruption with documents and moral outrage. She was braver than you, Kenneth said quietly. She was willing to risk everything for what she believed was right. And where did that bravery get her, dead in her bed, along with the child she was carrying? Kenneth's hands clenched into fists, and Joyce saw the muscle in his jaw tighten dangerously. She moved closer to him, her presence a calming influence that helped him maintain control. Kenneth said, his voice deadly calm. Quote 374. Zachary studied Kenneth's face, perhaps recognizing that his situation was hopeless, regardless of what he revealed. It was not difficult. A small amount of poison in her evening tea, something that would mimic the symptoms of influenza. She never even knew what was happening. The admission hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Joyce felt sick at the casual way Zachary described the murder, the clinical detachment with which he had ended 2 innocent lives. Why? Kenneth asked. Why not simply threaten her or try to buy her silence? Because Sarah Bailey was not the type of woman who could be threatened or bought. She had a moral certainty that made her dangerous to people like me. The only way to stop her was to eliminate her entirely. Kenneth stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. For a moment, Joyce thought he might attack Zachary despite the man's helpless condition. Instead, Kenneth walked to the window and stared out at the snow-covered yard where so much blood had been spilled. Put it down, Kenneth said, his voice barely above a whisper. Quote 380. Joyce felt tears sting her eyes at the pain in Kenneth's voice. She wanted to go to him, to offer comfort, but she sensed that he needed this moment to process the full weight of what Zachary had stolen from him. The child was an unexpected complication, Zachary continued, apparently oblivious to the impact his words were having. Sarah's pregnancy made her more determined to expose the corruption, not less. She said she wanted to leave her child a world worth living in. And you killed them both for it, Kenneth said, turning back from the window. I protected my interests. In business, sentiment is a luxury that can prove fatal. Joyce had heard enough. She moved to stand beside Kenneth, her hand finding his and holding it tightly. He is trying to hurt you, she said quietly. Do not let him succeed. Kenneth squeezed her hand gratefully, drawing strength from her presence. You are right, he has already taken enough from me. I will not give him my peace as well. The sound of horses approaching interrupted the conversation. Through the window, Joyce could see a group of riders making their way carefully up the snow-covered trail. Marshall Davis was in the lead, followed by three men she did not recognize. The cavalry arrives, Zachary observed with dark humor. I hope you are prepared for what comes next. Federal investigations have a way of consuming everyone they touch, guilty and innocent alike. Kenneth moved to the door, preparing to greet the arriving officials. We have nothing to hide, he said firmly. The truth is on our side. The truth is rarely as simple as people want it to be, Zachary replied, but I suppose you will learn that soon enough. Joyce remained in the kitchen as Kenneth went outside to meet the marshals. She could hear voices carrying across the snow, formal introductions and explanations that would begin the official process of documenting what had happened. Soon, this small cabin would be filled with investigators, lawyers, and officials, all seeking to understand and categorize the events that had unfolded here. You know, Zachary said conversationally, you could still walk away from this, change your name again, disappear into another territory where no one knows your history. Kenneth Bailey is a marked man now. Anyone associated with him will be painted with the same brush. Joyce turned to face him, her expression calm and resolved. I am not walking away. Even though it will mean years of legal proceedings, testimony, cross-examinations that will tear apart every aspect of your life, even though there are powerful people who will want revenge for what you have done here today, even then, Zachary studied her face, perhaps searching for signs of doubt or fear. You love him. It was not a question, and Joyce saw no reason to deny it. Yes, love is another luxury that can prove fatal in situations like this. Perhaps, but it is also what makes life worth living. The kitchen door opened and Kenneth returned with Marshall Davis and two other men. One was clearly another federal marshal, his bearing and badge marking him as a senior official. The other was older, well-dressed, with the soft hands and careful manner of a government bureaucrat. Mrs. Mitchell, Marshall Davis said, I would like you to meet Marshal Robert Harrison and Territorial Administrator William Chen. They will be handling the federal aspects of this investigation. Joyce nodded politely to both men, noting how their eyes assessed her with professional interest. She had become a key witness in what was clearly a major case, and she understood that her life would not be her own for some time to come. Mrs. Mitchell, Marshal Harrison said, we understand you have been instrumental in preserving crucial evidence in this matter. I did what needed to be done, Joyce replied simply. Indeed, we will need to take detailed statements from both you and Mr. Bailey, as well as examine all the documents and materials you have gathered. This investigation may take months to complete. Administrator Chen stepped forward, his manner more political than law enforcement. We also need to discuss protection arrangements. Mr. Nelson's organization has extensive reach, and there may be attempts at retaliation or intimidation. Joyce felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter air. She had been so focused on the immediate danger that she had not fully considered the long-term implications of what they had done. Zachary was just one part of a larger network, and that network would not take kindly to having one of its key members exposed and arrested. What kind of protection? Kenneth asked. Relocation, new identities, federal oversight until the trials are complete, and all associated threats have been neutralized, Marshal Harrison explained. It is not a decision to be made lightly, but it may be necessary for your safety. Joyce looked at Kenneth, seeing her own thoughts reflected in his eyes. They had fought so hard to protect this place, to preserve what Kenneth had built here. The idea of abandoning it all, of starting over somewhere else with new names and fabricated histories, felt like another kind of defeat. How long would such arrangements last? Kenneth asked. Difficult to say. Months certainly, possibly years. It depends on how extensive the network proves to be and how successfully we can prosecute the key figures. Administrator Chen consulted a leather portfolio he carried. There is also the matter of the mining operation itself. Given its central role in the corruption scheme, the federal government may need to assume temporary control while the investigation proceeds. This is my land, Kenneth said, his voice hardening. My mine, my livelihood. I will not simply hand it over to government bureaucrats. Mr. Bailey, Chen replied smoothly, I understand your concerns, but this is a matter of national security. The corruption we are investigating involves defense contracts and strategic mineral resources. The federal interest supersedes individual property rights. Joyce saw the anger building in Kenneth's face and moved to stand beside him. They had defeated Zachary only to face a new threat, one that came wrapped in legal authority and bureaucratic procedure. Joyce asked. Marshal Harrison's expression grew serious. Then you would be placing yourselves in considerable danger and potentially obstructing a federal investigation. I strongly advise against such a course of action. The room fell silent as everyone considered the implications. Outside, the winter wind had picked up again, rattling the windows and reminding them all of how isolated and vulnerable they really were. Zachary's laughter broke the silence, a sound devoid of humor or warmth. He said to Kenneth and Joyce. Marshal Harrison moved toward Zachary, his hand resting on his gun. Quote 424T, quote 425. Zachary's eyebrows rose in mock surprise. That seems rather dramatic. Selling strategic mineral resources to foreign agents qualifies as treason under federal law, Administrator Chen explained. The evidence Mrs. Mitchell preserved documents several such transactions. For the first time since his capture, Zachary looked genuinely shaken. Joyce realized that there were aspects of his crimes that even he had not fully understood, implications that reached far beyond simple corruption into matters of national security. I think, Kenneth said quietly, we need time to consider our options. Marshal Harrison nodded. Of course, but I should warn you that time is not a luxury we have in abundance. There are already signs that Nelson's associates are becoming aware of his arrest. We need to move quickly to ensure your safety. As the officials prepared to leave, taking Zachary with them for transport to a federal facility, Joyce found herself standing at the kitchen window again. The snow was falling once more, covering the bloodstains in the yard and transforming the scene of violence back into something peaceful and pristine. But she knew that the peace was illusory. The real battle was just beginning, and the outcome would determine not just their own fate, but the future of everything Kenneth had worked to build in this remote mountain valley. Behind her, Kenneth was discussing security arrangements with the marshals, his voice steady but strained. Joyce could hear the weight of responsibility in his words, the burden of knowing that his decisions would affect not just himself but the woman who had chosen to stand beside him. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new threats, new choices that would test their resolve and their commitment to each other. But tonight they were still here, still together, still fighting for something worth preserving. And sometimes, Joyce thought, that was enough. The federal marshals departed at first light, taking Zachary Nelson with them in shackles and leaving behind a silence that felt heavier than the snow-laden clouds overhead. Joyce stood at the kitchen window, watching the last of the riders disappear down the mountain trail, and tried to process everything that had changed in the span of a single day. Kenneth sat at the table behind her, methodically cleaning the rifles they had used in the fight. His movements were precise and automatic, the actions of a man who understood that vigilance was the price of survival. But Joyce could see the exhaustion in the set of his shoulders, the weight of decisions that would reshape their entire future. They will be back, Kenneth said without looking up from his work. The marshals, the bureaucrats, probably others we have not met yet. This place will never be the same. Joyce turned from the window to face him. Does that frighten you? Kenneth considered the question seriously, his pale eyes reflecting the complexity of his feelings. Yes and no, I am frightened of losing everything I have built here, everything Sarah and I dreamed of creating. But I am also relieved that the truth is finally coming out, that there might actually be justice for what was done to her. And what about us? What we talked about yesterday, before all this happened? Kenneth set down the rifle and looked at her directly. That depends on what you want, Joyce. The life I can offer you now is not what it was even 24 hours ago. There will be investigations, trials, probably threats from people we have never heard of. If you want to leave, if you want to take a new identity and start fresh somewhere else, I would understand. Joyce moved to sit across from him, her hands folded on the rough wooden table. Do you want me to leave? No, Kenneth said immediately, but I want you to stay for the right reasons, not out of some misplaced sense of obligation or because you are afraid to be alone again. I am not afraid to be alone, Joyce replied. I was alone for a long time before I came here, and I survived it, but surviving is not the same as living. Kenneth reached across the table to take her hand, his calloused fingers intertwining with hers. Then what do you want to do? Joyce thought of the federal officials and their offers of protection, of new identities, and fresh starts in places where no one would know their history. She thought of the mining operation that might be seized by the government, of the home they had built together being transformed into evidence in a federal investigation. But she also thought of the evidence they had preserved, of Zachary Nelson finally facing justice for his crimes, of the possibility that their actions might prevent others from suffering as Sarah Bailey had suffered. I want to stay, she said firmly. I want to fight for this place, for what we can build here together. And I want to see this through to the end, whatever that might be. Kenneth's grip on her hand tightened. Quote 446 to quote 447, Joyce replied. Quote 448. Kenneth smiled, the first genuine expression of happiness she had seen from him since the marshals arrived. Quote he said. Quote Yvonne, Joyce said. Quote found. Kenneth was quiet for a moment, his eyes growing distant as he accessed memories that were clearly both painful and precious. But the decided 453, he said finally. Quote 454. Quote 455 on. Quote 456 on. Joyce felt a deep respect for the woman she had never met. The woman whose death had brought her and Kenneth together. Quote 457. Quote 458. A knock at the door interrupted their conversation. Both of them tensed, hands moving instinctively toward weapons before they recognized the voice calling out from the porch. Kenneth opened the door to reveal a young woman in her 20s, bundled in heavy winter clothing and clearly exhausted from the difficult journey up the mountain. Lisa Scott was known to both of them as one of the few people in Cedar Ridge who was not connected to Zachary's operation. Miss Scott, Kenneth said, stepping aside to let her enter. What brings you all the way up here in this weather? Lisa accepted the cup of coffee Joyce offered her, warming her hands around the ceramic mug before speaking. There has been talk in town, she said carefully, about what happened here yesterday, about Zachary Nelson being arrested. What kind of talk? Joyce asked. Some people are saying that you are heroes, that you finally stood up to the corruption that has been poisoning our community for years. But others are saying that you have brought trouble down on all of us, that there will be consequences for what you have done. Kenneth sat heavily in his chair. What kind of consequences? Men have been arriving in town since yesterday evening. Strangers who ask a lot of questions and do not seem interested in mining or legitimate business. They are asking about you, about Mrs. Mitchell, about anyone who might have helped you or supported you. Joyce felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter air. How many men? At least a dozen that I have seen, probably more. They are not staying at the hotel or the boarding house, which means they are camping somewhere outside town, or staying with people who do not want their presence known. Kenneth and Joyce exchanged glances, both understanding the implications immediately. Zachary's network was moving quickly to contain the damage from his arrest, and that meant eliminating anyone who might have information that could further incriminate them. Quote 470, Kenneth said. Quote 471. Lisa straightened in her chair, her young face showing a determination that reminded Joyce of Kenneth's description of his late wife. Mr. Bailey, my father worked in the mines before Zachary Nelson took control of the operations. He died in a cave-in that everyone knew could have been prevented if proper safety measures had been in place. I am not going to stand by and watch good people be intimidated or hurt because they finally had the courage to do what needed to be done. What are you proposing? Joyce asked. There are others in town who feel the same way I do. People who have lost family members or friends to Zachary's greed and corruption. We want to help, to stand with you against whatever is coming. Kenneth shook his head firmly. Absolutely not. These are dangerous people we are dealing with. Professionals who will not hesitate to kill innocent civilians. I will not have the blood of good people on my hands. With respect, Mr. Bailey, Lisa replied, that choice is not yours to make. We are already involved whether you want us to be or not. The question is whether we stand together or face this threat divided. Joyce studied the young woman's face, seeing echoes of her own journey from fear to determination. Quote, Honda quote, Biden, Kenneth asked. Quote fun, Kenneth was quiet for a long moment, weighing the risks and benefits of accepting help from civilians who had no training for the kind of conflict they were facing. Joyce could see him struggling with his protective instincts, his desire to shield others from the danger that had already claimed so much from him. Quote eternity too, Lisa continued. Quote Failure, Joyce asked. Quote do I five? Joyce felt the blood drain from her face. If Zachary's associates had discovered her true identity, if they knew about her connection to Richard Thornton and the legal expertise she had acquired working for him, then the danger was even greater than they had imagined. How could they know that? Kenneth asked. I do not know, Lisa replied, but they seemed very well informed about Mrs. Mitchell's background, about her journey west and the circumstances that brought her here. Joyce's mind raced through the possibilities. She had been careful to cover her tracks, to create a plausible history for Joyce Mitchell that would not lead back to Martha Morgan. But if someone with sufficient resources and connections had decided to investigate her thoroughly, they might have found inconsistencies or connections that revealed the truth. Kenneth said grimly. Joyce pointed out. Quote 492, quote 493, Mom. Lisa leaned forward urgently. Quote 494. Kenneth stood and moved to the window, staring out at the snow-covered landscape that had been his sanctuary and was now becoming his battleground. Quote 495, Maroon. Quote 496, Joyce said quietly. Both Kenneth and Lisa turned to look at her, waiting for her to continue. Quote 497. Kenneth's eyebrows rose. What are you suggesting? I am suggesting that we use my legal background and your knowledge of the mining operation to build a case that goes beyond what the federal marshals are investigating. We document everything, every connection, every crime, every person involved in Zachary's network. And then we make sure that information reaches not just the federal authorities, but newspapers, political figures, anyone who can bring pressure to bear. That would be incredibly dangerous, Kenneth warned. More dangerous than sitting here waiting for assassins to find us, Joyce countered. More dangerous than hoping that federal bureaucrats will protect us while they pursue their own agenda? Lisa nodded enthusiastically. She is right. The best defense is a good offense. If we can expose the entire network, if we can make their activities public knowledge, it becomes much harder for them to operate in the shadows. Kenneth returned to the table, his expression thoughtful. It would require careful planning, reliable intelligence, and people we can trust absolutely. I can provide the people, Lisa said. There are at least 20 families in town who have suffered because of Zachary's operation. They will help if they know it means bringing down the entire corrupt system. And I can provide the legal framework, Joyce added. I know how to build a case that will hold up in court, how to document evidence in ways that cannot be dismissed or discredited. Kenneth looked at both women, seeing the determination in their faces and recognizing something that reminded him powerfully of his late wife. Sarah always said that the most dangerous thing you could do to corrupt people was to drag their activities into the light where everyone could see them. Then that is what we do, Joyce said firmly. We drag everything into the light and let the truth speak for itself. Kenneth nodded slowly, his decision made. All right, but we do this carefully, methodically, with full understanding of the risks we are taking. And if at any point it becomes clear that we are in over our heads, we fall back to the Federal Protection Program. Agreed, Joyce said. Agreed, Lisa echoed. As they began to plan their campaign against Zachary's network, Joyce felt a sense of purpose and determination that she had not experienced since her days working for Richard Thornton. She was no longer just a victim fleeing from her past or a refugee seeking shelter from the storm. She was a woman with skills and knowledge and the will to use them in service of something larger than herself. The battle for justice was far from over, but for the first time since Zachary's arrest, Joyce felt confident that they had a real chance of winning it. Outside, the snow continued to fall, but the winter no longer felt like an ending. It felt like a beginning. The war they declared began not with gunfire, but with whispers carried on the mountain wind. 3 days after Lisa Scott's warning, Joyce woke to find Kenneth already dressed and standing at the kitchen window, his rifle cradled in his arms like a sleeping child. The pre-dawn darkness revealed nothing to her untrained eyes, but she could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his head tilted slightly as if listening for sounds that did not belong to the natural world. Quote 5 foot, she asked quietly, moving to stand beside him. Quote Barsh 5 1 the skin, Kenneth replied, his voice barely above a whisper. Quote 517. Joyce felt her stomach clench with familiar fear, but underneath it was something new, something that felt like steel, wrapped in silk. She was no longer the frightened woman who had arrived in Cedar Ridge with nothing but these and desperation. The past weeks had forged her into something harder, more resilient. Quote 518, she asked. Quote 519, and Kenneth's pale eyes never left the window. Lisa was right. Zachary's people are moving faster than the federal marshals anticipated. Joyce moved to the cabinet where they kept the spare ammunition, checking the loads in her pistol with movements that had become automatic. The weight of the weapon in her hands no longer felt foreign or frightening. It felt like a tool, no different from the kitchen knife she used to prepare meals or the pen she wielded to document evidence. How long do we have? She asked. Hard to say. If they are smart, they will wait until full daylight to make their move. Gives them better visibility and reduces the chance of accidents that might complicate their story. Joyce understood the implication. Whatever happened here today would need to look plausible to outside observers. A tragic accident, perhaps, or a confrontation with dangerous criminals that had gone wrong. Zachary's associates were professionals who understood the importance of maintaining appearances. The sound of hoofbeats approaching from the opposite direction made both of them turn toward the front of the house. Kenneth moved quickly to the other window, his expression growing grim as he identified the new arrivals. Joyce asked. Joyce felt her heart leap into her throat. The young woman who had risked so much to bring them warning was now walking directly into the crosshairs of men who would not hesitate to kill anyone who stood in their way. Kenneth was already moving toward the door, but Joyce caught his arm. Kenneth paused, his hand on the door latch. Joyce's mind raced through possibilities, weighing risks and potential outcomes with the analytical skills she had learned working for Richard Thornton. We let them come to the house. Once they are inside, we have better control of the situation. And the men watching from the trees? They will not open fire if their own people might be caught in the crossfire. We use that against them. Kenneth studied her face, seeing the transformation that had taken place in the woman who had once been afraid of her own shadow. You are thinking like a strategist now. I am thinking like someone who refuses to lose anyone else to these people. The riders were close enough now that Joyce could see Lisa's face clearly, along with her 3 companions. She recognized 2 of them from her occasional trips to town, miners who had worked for Kenneth before Zachary's corruption had poisoned the local operations. The third was a stranger, but his bearing suggested military experience. Kenneth opened the door as the 4 riders reached the porch, his rifle held in a position that was ready, but not immediately threatening. Lisa, you need to get inside quickly. We are being watched. Lisa's eyes widened, but she did not hesitate. She dismounted and moved toward the house, followed closely by her companions. The last man through the door was indeed a former soldier, Joyce realized, noting the way he automatically positioned himself to cover the entrance, while the others moved deeper into the room. Quote 5, Lisa said breathlessly, quote, Joyce studied the 3 men, assessing their capabilities and potential reliability. Thomas Rodriguez was young but had the steady hands and alert eyes of someone who had faced danger before. Samuel Chen was older, perhaps 50, with the weathered face of a man who had spent his life in hard physical labor. Marcus Webb was the former soldier, his military bearing unmistakable despite his civilian clothes. Kenneth said, quote, Marcus Webb stepped forward, his voice carrying the authority of command. Quote 537. Quote 5, Joyce asked. Quote 5, Webb replied. Quote 4, Kenneth moved to the window again, his attention drawn by movement in the tree line. Quote 541. Joyce felt the familiar chill of fear, but it was tempered now by something else, something that felt like anticipation. For months, she had been running from threats, hiding from dangers, hoping that someone else would solve the problems that plagued her life. But hiding had not saved Sarah Bailey, and it would not save them either. Quote 542, she said when, quote 4, quote 4, Webb replied, producing a compact device from his saddlebags. Quote 4, quote 4, quote 5, and Kenneth was already shaking his head. Quote 548, quote 549. Thomas Rodriguez spoke up, quote 550. Joyce studied the young man's face, seeing the determination there, but also recognizing the fear he was trying to hide. Thomas, you do not have to do this. None of you do. Yes, ma'am, we do, Samuel Chen said quietly. My brother died because good people did nothing, while bad people ran wild. I will not let that happen again. The sound of gunfire erupted from the direction of the main trail, sharp cracks that echoed off the mountain walls like thunder. Everyone in the house froze, straining to identify the source and meaning of the shots. Could be a signal, Webb said grimly, or it could mean the federal marshals are closer than we thought. Kenneth moved to the back window, his expression growing more concerned. Or it could mean they are eliminating witnesses who might complicate their story. Joyce felt ice form in her veins at the implication. If Zachary's men were killing anyone who might be able to testify about what had happened, then the danger extended far beyond just the people in this house. Quote 57, she said firmly. Quote 5 the Webb nodded, always wanted to checking his equipment. Quote, quote, found on, Joyce moved to the cabinet where Kenneth kept his mining supplies, retrieving a small mirror that could be used for signaling. Quote, downbound. Quote, Anasam, Webb replied, producing his own mirror. Quote, I just found. Kenneth was studying the positioning of the men in the trees, his tactical mind working through the problems they faced. Quote, Irish. Lisa moved to help Joyce gather supplies, her young face set with determination that reminded Joyce powerfully of herself at that age. The 565 quote 566, Joyce replied. Quote 567. The gunfire from the main trail had stopped, leaving behind a silence that felt ominous and heavy. Whatever had happened down there was finished, and Joyce suspected that the outcome had not been favorable to their cause. Bonavarton and Kenneth said, quote, fam. Webb and Thomas Rodriguez moved toward the back door, their weapons ready and their faces grim with purpose. Samuel Chen positioned himself at the front window, his rifle trained on the tree line where movement had been spotted. Joyce found herself standing beside Kenneth, watching as the two men prepared to risk their lives for people they barely knew, for a cause that offered them no personal benefit beyond the satisfaction of doing what was right. She asked quietly. Kenneth's answer was simple and profound. Because someone has to. The back door opened with the soft creak of hinges that had never been oiled for stealth, and Thomas Rodriguez slipped out into the gray morning light like a shadow-given form. Joyce watched from the kitchen window as the young man moved with surprising grace across the snow-covered ground, his dark clothing helping him blend with the shadows cast by the overhanging pines. Marcus Webb waited 30 seconds before following, his military training evident in the way he used available cover to mask his movement. The telegraph equipment was strapped to his back in a canvas bag that had been darkened with soot to reduce its visibility against the snow. Joyce held her breath as both men reached the edge of the gully Thomas had described, a natural depression in the landscape that would provide concealment for most of their journey to the pine grove. For a moment, they were completely exposed, silhouetted against the white ground like targets in a shooting gallery. Then they were gone, swallowed by the shadows and irregular terrain that only someone with intimate knowledge of the mountain could navigate safely. Joyce released the breath she had been holding and turned her attention back to the tree line where Zachary's men were positioned. Samuel Chen called softly from his position at the front window. Quote 573. Kenneth moved to join him, his pale eyes scanning the forest for signs of the watchers who had been observing them since before dawn. Quote 574. Lisa Scott had positioned herself at the side window, her own rifle held with the competence of someone who had grown up in mining country, where self-defense was a necessary skill. Quote 576, Kenneth replied. Quote 577. Joyce checked the loads in her pistol again, a nervous habit that had developed over the past few days. The familiar weight of the weapon was reassuring, but she knew that if this situation devolved into a sustained firefight, her limited experience would be a significant disadvantage. The sound of breaking glass from somewhere in the house made everyone freeze. It was not the sharp crack of a window being shot out, but the duller sound of something being thrown through glass from outside. Quote 578. Kenneth said grimly, already moving toward the stairs with his rifle ready. Joyce followed him, her heart hammering against her ribs as they climbed toward the source of the disturbance. The upper floor of the house consisted of 2 bedrooms and a small storage area, all of which had windows that provided excellent fields of fire, but also made them vulnerable to attack from multiple directions. Kenneth's bedroom window had been broken, and lying on the floor among the scattered glass was a small canvas bag tied with rope. Kenneth approached it carefully, his weapon trained on the opening in case this was some kind of trap. "What is it?" Joyce asked, staying back from the window, but ready to provide covering fire if needed. Kenneth used the barrel of his rifle to move the bag, checking for wires or other signs that it might be booby-trapped. When nothing happened, he carefully picked it up and opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper covered with handwriting that Kenneth recognized immediately. His face went pale as he read the contents, his hands trembling slightly as he absorbed the implications of what he was seeing. "What does it say?" Joyce asked, moving closer. Kenneth handed her the paper without a word. The message was brief but devastating in its simplicity. "Mrs. Mitchell, we have your friend Marshall Davis. If you want to see him alive again, you will surrender yourself and all evidence in your possession within 1 hour. Come alone to the main trail junction. Any attempt to involve federal authorities or local law enforcement will result in the marshal's immediate execution. You have been warned." Joyce felt the world tilt around her as she processed the implications. Marshall Davis had been captured, probably during the gunfire they had heard from the direction of the main trail. The federal investigation that was supposed to protect them had been compromised, and now they were truly on their own. "It could be a lie," Kenneth said, though his voice lacked conviction. "A trick to get you to surrender." "Or it could be the truth," Joyce replied. "And if it is, then Marshall Davis will die because of choices I made." Kenneth moved to the broken window, scanning the tree line for any sign of the men who had delivered this ultimatum. "Joyce, you cannot seriously be considering surrendering to them. Even if they do have Davis, even if they let him go, they will kill you the moment they have what they want." "I know that," Joyce said quietly, "but I also know that I cannot live with myself if a good man dies because I was too cowardly to face the consequences of my actions. This is not about cowardice. This is about tactics, about making smart decisions that give us the best chance of saving everyone." Joyce studied the message again, noting details that her legal training had taught her to observe. The handwriting was educated, the language formal and precise. This was not a hastily scrawled threat from desperate criminals, but a carefully composed ultimatum from people who understood the psychological impact of their words. "They want me specifically," she said. "Not you, not the evidence, not the mine operation. They want Martha Morgan, the woman who worked for Richard Thornton and knows how to build legal cases that can destroy corrupt networks. Which is exactly why you cannot give yourself to them." "Kenneth," Joyce said, turning to face him directly, "what if there is another way?" Before Kenneth could respond, the sound of rifle fire erupted from the direction of the pine grove where Webb and Rodriguez had gone to set up the telegraph. The shots were rapid and sustained, suggesting a significant engagement rather than a brief exchange. Both of them rushed to the front window, trying to see what was happening in the distant trees. Smoke was visible rising from the pine grove, and the sporadic crack of gunfire continued to echo across the mountain valley. "They found them," Kenneth said grimly. Joyce felt despair rising in her throat like bile. Their plan to contact federal authorities had failed. Marshall Davis was a prisoner, and now two more good men were probably dead or dying because they had tried to help. "We have to do something," she said. "We are doing something. We are surviving. And as long as we survive, there is still hope that the truth will come out." But even as Kenneth spoke the words, Joyce could hear the doubt in his voice. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and running out of options. The federal investigation that was supposed to bring justice had been compromised, and the local support they had counted on was being systematically eliminated. The gunfire from the pine grove stopped abruptly, leaving behind a silence that felt like a death knell. Joyce strained to see any sign of movement in the distant trees, any indication that Webb and Rodriguez had survived the engagement, but the forest revealed nothing. 1 hour, Joyce said, reading the ultimatum again. "They gave us 1 hour to decide." "There is nothing to decide," Kenneth replied firmly. "You are not surrendering to them." "Then what do you propose we do? Wait here until they get tired of playing games and simply burn the house down around us?" Kenneth was quiet for a long moment, his pale eyes reflecting the complexity of their situation. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a resolution that Joyce had not heard before. "We take the fight to them," he said. "What do you mean?" "I mean we stop reacting to their moves and start making some of our own. They expect us to cower in here, to wait for rescue that may never come, to make desperate choices based on fear and emotion." Joyce felt a spark of hope kindle in her chest. "What are you thinking?" "I am thinking that this mountain has been my home for 8 years. I know every trail, every hiding place, every natural advantage it offers. And I am thinking that men who are comfortable operating in cities and towns might not be as effective in wilderness conditions. You want to abandon the house? I want to use it as bait while we circle around behind them. They are expecting us to stay here, to defend this position. If we can get into the trees without being detected, we might be able to turn the tables on them." Joyce considered the proposal, weighing its risks against the alternatives. Staying in the house meant certain capture or death once their ammunition ran out. Surrendering meant certain death for herself and probably for Kenneth as well. But attempting to outmaneuver professional killers in terrain they did not know offered at least some chance of success. "What about Lisa and Samuel?" she asked. "They stay here. Keep up the appearance that we are still defending the house. If our plan works, they can surrender once we have dealt with the real threat. And if our plan does not work?" Kenneth's smile was grim but determined. Quote 613. Joyce moved to the window again, studying the layout of the surrounding forest and trying to visualize the route Kenneth was proposing. The back of the house offered some concealment, but reaching the tree line would require crossing open ground where they would be visible to anyone watching from the right angle. She asked. Quote 615. Kenneth replied. Quote 616. Joyce felt her pulse quicken. An escape route that Zachary's men probably did not know about offered exactly the kind of advantage they needed to change the dynamics of this confrontation. How long to reach the tunnel exit? 10 minutes if we move carefully, 5 if we take risks. And then? Then we become the hunters instead of the hunted. Joyce looked around the bedroom that had become a fortress, at the broken window and the ultimatum that lay crumpled on the floor. In 1 hour, Zachary's men would expect her to walk down the mountain trail and surrender herself to certain death. Instead, she would be moving through the forest like a ghost, carrying the skills Richard Thornton had taught her and the determination that months of hardship had forged in her soul. Quote 621, she said. Quote 622. The root cellar was darker than Joyce remembered, a cramped space that smelled of damp earth and stored vegetables. Kenneth moved ahead of her with the confidence of someone who had traversed this route many times, his hands finding handholds and footing that were invisible to her untrained eyes. The tunnel that connected to the mine workings was narrow and low, forcing them to crawl on their hands and knees through passages carved from living rock. Joyce's breathing echoed strangely in the confined space, and she had to fight down the claustrophobia that threatened to overwhelm her rational mind. Behind them, they could hear Lisa and Samuel moving around the house, maintaining the illusion that all 4 defenders were still in position. The sound of their footsteps and occasional voices would hopefully convince the watchers that nothing had changed, that the ultimatum was still being debated by people with no good options. Kenneth paused at a junction where the tunnel branched in 2 directions, his head tilted as he listened for sounds that might indicate danger ahead. The silence was complete except for the distant drip of water somewhere in the darkness. "Which way?" Joyce whispered. "Left leads to the main mine shaft. Right leads to the emergency exit. We go right." They continued crawling through the narrow passage, Joyce's knees and palms growing numb from the cold stone beneath them. Her rifle, slung across her back, caught on the tunnel wall several times, forcing her to pause and work it free without making noise that might carry to the surface. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, Kenneth stopped at what appeared to be a dead end. Joyce could see his hands working at something above their heads, and then a section of the tunnel ceiling swung away on hidden hinges. Pale daylight filtered down through the opening, along with the sound of wind moving through pine branches. Kenneth listened carefully before pulling himself up into the opening, then reached down to help Joyce climb out of the tunnel. They emerged behind a screen of dense undergrowth about 50 yards inside the tree line, exactly as Kenneth had promised. The concealment was excellent, but Joyce could see through the branches to where the house sat in its clearing, looking peaceful and innocent despite the deadly game being played around it. Kenneth carefully replaced the camouflage cover over the tunnel entrance, ensuring that their escape route remained secret. Then he motioned for Joyce to follow him deeper into the forest, away from the house and the men who were watching it. Moving through the woods required skills that Joyce had never developed, but Kenneth guided her with hand signals and whispered instructions, teaching her to step on rocks and fallen logs to avoid leaving tracks in the snow. The process was slow and nerve-wracking, but gradually they worked their way around the perimeter of the area where Zachary's men were positioned. Kenneth stopped behind a massive pine tree and pointed through the branches to where two men were crouched behind a fallen log, their rifles trained on the house. They were close enough that Joyce could hear fragments of their conversation carried on the wind. "How much longer are we supposed to wait?" one of them was asking. "Boss said 1 hour. Still got 40 minutes. And if she does not come out, then we go in and get her. Either way, this ends today." Joyce felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. These men were not planning to honor any agreement, not planning to release Marshall Davis even if she did surrender. They were here to eliminate everyone who posed a threat to Zachary's network, and they would do it regardless of what choices she made. Kenneth motioned for her to stay put, then began working his way closer to the two watchers. His movement through the forest was silent and purposeful, the result of years spent hunting in these mountains. Joyce watched him disappear into the shadows between the trees, becoming invisible even though she knew exactly where he had gone. The minutes stretched like hours as Joyce waited, straining to hear any sound that might indicate Kenneth had been discovered. The two men continued their quiet conversation, unaware that death was moving toward them through the forest they thought they controlled. When Kenneth struck, it was with the swift efficiency of a predator taking prey. Joyce saw a brief flurry of movement behind the fallen log, heard a muffled grunt, and then silence. Kenneth appeared a moment later, motioning for her to join him. The two men were unconscious but alive, their weapons confiscated and their hands bound with their own belts. Kenneth had moved with surgical precision, neutralizing the threat without creating the kind of disturbance that would alert other watchers. "Code 629, Joyce whispered. "Code 630. Joyce studied the two unconscious men, noting their professional equipment and the casual way they had discussed murder. These were not local thugs or desperate criminals, but experienced killers who had probably eliminated dozens of witnesses and obstacles over the years. "Quote 631, as she asked. "Quote 632. Kenneth was already moving toward the next position, following a route that kept them concealed while allowing them to observe the enemy positions. Joyce followed, her confidence growing as she began to understand the tactical situation they faced. The next pair of watchers was positioned behind a cluster of boulders that provided excellent cover from the house but left them vulnerable to approach from the sides. Kenneth studied their position for several minutes, noting the rhythm of their vigilance and the moments when their attention was focused elsewhere. This time, Joyce was close enough to see the entire engagement. Kenneth moved like smoke through the trees, appearing behind the two men with the suddenness of a lightning strike. One went down immediately from a blow to the head, while the other had time to turn before Kenneth's fist connected with his jaw. Both men were unconscious within seconds, their weapons secured and their communications equipment destroyed. Kenneth was developing a systematic approach to neutralizing Zachary's forces, one that minimized noise and avoided the kind of sustained gunfight that would draw reinforcements. Quote 633, Kenneth whispered as Joyce joined him behind the boulders. Quote 630-14, quote 635 as Joyce considered the possibility, but her instincts told her otherwise. The ultimatum had been too specific, too confident in its demands. Zachary's people had Davis, and they were using him as leverage to force her into a position where she could be eliminated quietly. The sound of voices from the direction of the house made both of them freeze. Someone was calling out, probably trying to establish contact with the watchers who were no longer responding to communications checks. "They are starting to realize something is wrong," Kenneth observed. "How long before they investigate?" "Not long. We need to move faster." Kenneth led her toward the next position, but as they moved through the trees, Joyce caught sight of movement in an unexpected direction. Two men were approaching the house from the front, their weapons ready and their manner suggesting they were preparing for immediate action. The hour is not up yet, Joyce whispered. They are not waiting for the deadline. Something has made them decide to move now. Joyce realized that their systematic elimination of the Watchers had probably disrupted the enemy's communication network. When men failed to respond to radio checks, when predetermined signals were not given on schedule, professional operators assumed the worst and adjusted their tactics accordingly. Quote 641, Joyce said. Kenneth was already moving, abandoning stealth for speed as he raced through the trees toward a position where he could see the front of the house clearly. Joyce followed, her heart hammering as she realized they were about to witness the confrontation they had hoped to prevent. The two men reached the porch and took positions on either side of the front door. Their movements coordinated and professional. One of them called out in a voice that carried clearly across the clearing. Quote 642. There was no response from inside the house, which was exactly what Kenneth had instructed Lisa and Samuel to do. But Joyce could see the tension in the attackers' postures, the way they were preparing to breach the door and storm the building. Kenneth raised his rifle, sighting carefully on the man closest to the door. At this range, in these conditions, he could probably take both men before they could react. But gunfire would alert any remaining Watchers and potentially trigger a larger battle that might result in casualties among the people they were trying to protect. Wait, Joyce whispered, her hand on Kenneth's arm. Quote 6 on. Quote 6 on. Kenneth hesitated, his finger poised on the trigger as he weighed the risks and benefits of immediate action. In that moment of indecision, the situation changed dramatically. The front door of the house opened, and Lisa Scott stepped out onto the porch with her hands raised above her head. Her face was pale but determined, her voice steady as she addressed the two gunmen. Quote 646, she said clearly. Quote 647. Joyce felt her blood turn to ice as she watched Lisa Scott face down two professional killers with nothing but courage and the desperate hope that her sacrifice might buy time for others. The young woman stood on the porch like a figure carved from stone, her hands raised but her chin held high in defiance of the men who held her life in their hands. Quote 648, the closer gunman demanded, his weapon trained on Lisa's chest. Gone, Lisa replied. She and Mr. Bailey left through the back of the house about 20 minutes ago. They are probably halfway to town by now. Joyce could see the calculation in the gunman's eyes as he processed this information. If she and Kenneth had indeed fled, then the entire operation had been compromised. The careful plan to eliminate witnesses and recover evidence had failed, and now damage control became the priority. Quote 651, the second gunman said, stepping closer to Lisa with his rifle raised. Quote 652, quote 653. Lisa's voice carried a bitter edge that was entirely convincing. Mrs. Mitchell is a city woman who never belonged in these mountains. When things got dangerous, she ran like a rabbit, just like all the others who came before her. Kenneth's grip on his rifle tightened, and Joyce could see him preparing to take the shot that would save Lisa's life. But she also understood that Lisa was buying them time, creating confusion and doubt that might give them a tactical advantage. Check the house, the first gunman ordered his companion. If they are really gone, there should be signs of their departure. The second man moved toward the door, but before he could enter, Samuel Chen appeared in the doorway with his hands also raised. The older man's face was grim but calm, his manner suggesting someone who had accepted whatever fate awaited him. Samuel said, quote 658. The lie was smoothly delivered, so purported by details that made it sound plausible. Joyce realized that Lisa and Samuel had prepared the story in advance, understanding that they might need to misdirect their enemies to protect the real plan. Quote 6599, the first gunman ordered. Quote 660, as one of the men entered the house, Kenneth shifted his position to get a clear shot at the remaining gunman. But Joyce caught his arm again, her mind racing through the implications of what they were witnessing. Quote I am, she whispered. Quote Shannon. Kenneth's pale eyes met hers, and she could see him struggling with the decision. Every instinct told him to protect the innocent people who had risked their lives to help them. But the tactical situation demanded patience, demanded that they think beyond the immediate crisis to the larger picture. The gunman who had entered the house emerged a few minutes later, his expression confirming what Lisa and Samuel had told them. No sign of recent occupation in the bedrooms. Looks like they packed in a hurry and left. What about the stable? Two horses missing, along with the saddles and supplies. Trail leads toward the main road. The first gunman lowered his weapon slightly, his attention shifting from Lisa and Samuel to the broader implications of their quarry's escape. Quote 666 point. Quote 667. Joyce felt a moment of admiration for Lisa's quick thinking. By claiming that she and Kenneth had fled on horseback, the young woman had created a false trail that would send at least some of their enemies in the wrong direction. What do we do with these two? The second gunman asked, gesturing toward Lisa and Samuel. Boss said no witnesses. That includes anyone who might have helped them or knows what they were planning. The casual way the man discussed murder made Joyce's stomach clench with rage and fear. These people killed as easily as breathing, without conscience or remorse or any recognition of the value of human life. Kenneth was raising his rifle again, but before he could fire, the sound of approaching horses carried across the clearing. Three more riders were coming up the main trail, their pace suggesting urgency rather than routine patrol. Kenneth muttered, quote 671 round. The new arrivals reached the house just as the two gunmen were preparing to execute Lisa and Samuel. Joyce recognized the lead rider immediately, despite the distance and the winter clothing that partially concealed his features. It was Zachary Nelson himself, somehow free from federal custody and leading what appeared to be a rescue operation. His presence changed everything, transforming a tactical situation into a personal confrontation that had been building for months. Zachary dismounted and approached the porch with the confident stride of a man who believed he controlled every aspect of the situation. His pale eyes swept over Lisa and Samuel with the same casual assessment he might give to livestock at market. He asked without preamble, quote 673. The first gunman reported, quote 674. Zachary studied Lisa's face with the intensity of a man who made his living reading people and detecting deception. Miss Scott, is it not? I remember you from town. Your father worked in my mines before his unfortunate accident. Lisa's composure cracked slightly at the reminder of her father's death, but she held Zachary's gaze steadily. Quote 676, quote 7, Zachary replied smoothly. Quote 6, quote 7, Samuel Chen stepped forward, his voice shaking with suppressed anger. Quote 680, Zachary's smile was cold and predatory. Mr. Chen, your brother made the mistake of asking too many questions about working conditions. I hope you are not planning to repeat his error. The casual admission of guilt was stunning in its arrogance. Zachary was so confident in his position, so certain that none of these people would survive to testify against him, that he felt free to discuss his crimes openly. Kenneth's rifle was trained on Zachary now, his finger resting lightly on the trigger. At this range, he could end the threat permanently with a single shot, but Joyce could see other considerations at work in his expression. She whispered. Joyce understood the impossible choice they faced. Action meant saving Lisa and Samuel, but potentially condemning Marshall Davis to death. Inaction meant watching innocent people die while hoping for a chance to rescue the federal officer. Quote 6, Joyce said, an idea forming in her mind. Quote 6, man, quote alt. Kenneth's eyes widened in alarm. Absolutely not. That is exactly what he wants, and it will not save anyone. It might if we do it right, if I can get close enough to Zachary, if I can find out where Davis is being held, then you can mount a rescue operation. Joyce, you are talking about walking into certain death. I am talking about creating an opportunity where none exists now. Look at that situation. Zachary has all the advantages, all the control. We need to change the dynamic. Meredith studied the scene in the clearing where Zachary was continuing his interrogation of Lisa and Samuel. The other gunmen were positioned to provide security, but their attention was focused outward, watching for threats from the forest rather than expecting attack from within their perimeter. Even if you could get close to Zachary, even if you could learn where Davis is being held, how would you communicate that information to me? Kenneth asked. Joyce considered the problem, drawing on skills she had learned working for Richard Thornton when they had dealt with sensitive cases involving dangerous people. There are ways, coded phrases, predetermined signals. If I can stay alive long enough to gather intelligence, I can find a way to pass it along. This is insane. You are talking about sacrificing yourself on the chance that it might create an opportunity to save others. I am talking about using the one advantage we have. Zachary needs me alive, at least temporarily. That gives me leverage that none of the others possess. Kenneth was quiet for a long moment, his pale eyes reflecting the agony of a man forced to choose between protecting the woman he loved and saving the lives of innocent people. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. If you do this, if you walk into that clearing, I might not be able to get you out. I know, Joyce replied, but if I do not do this, Lisa and Samuel will die, and we will never find Marshall Davis. And eventually Zachary will hunt us down anyway. There has to be another way. Kenneth, look at me. Joyce turned to face him fully, her hands reaching up to cup his weathered face. I am not the frightened woman who arrived here last fall. I am not someone who needs to be protected from hard choices. I am someone who can make those choices and live with the consequences. Kenneth's hands covered hers, his touch gentle despite the calluses and scars that marked years of hard labor. But by the shared one, .02 bomb. The sound of Zachary's voice carried across the clearing, sharp with impatience and growing anger. I'm going to ask you one more time. Where did Bailey and the woman go? We told you, Lisa replied. They ran, like cowards always do when things get difficult. Zachary's hand moved to the pistol at his hip, his patience clearly at an end. Wood 706, Joyce made her decision. Before Kenneth could stop her, she was moving through the trees toward the edge of the clearing, her rifle held high above her head in a gesture of surrender. Quote 707, she called out, her voice carrying clearly across the snow-covered ground. Quote 708. The clearing fell silent as Joyce stepped out of the tree line, her rifle held high above her head and her steps measured and deliberate. Every eye was focused on her, from Zachary's predatory gaze to the surprised expressions of his gunmen to the relief and terror that warred across Lisa Scott's young face. Zachary's hand moved away from his pistol, his posture relaxing slightly as he realized that his primary objective was walking directly toward him. But Joyce could see the calculation in his pale eyes, the way he was assessing this unexpected development for traps and hidden dangers. Mrs. Joyce Mitchell, Zachary said, his voice carrying the false warmth she remembered from their first meeting. How good of you to join us. Though I must admit, I am surprised to see you here when my men reported that you had fled. Joyce stopped about 20 feet from the porch, close enough to be heard clearly, but far enough away to give Kenneth a clear shot if the situation deteriorated rapidly. I did flee, she said, allowing exhaustion and fear to color her voice. But I came back when I realized you had taken Marshall Davis. Ah, so you do care about the good Marshall's welfare. How touching. I care about innocent people not dying because of choices I have made, Joyce replied. What do you want? Zachary stepped down from the porch, moving closer to her with the confidence of a man who believed he held all the advantages. I want the evidence you and your late employer gathered about my business operations. I want the names of everyone you have shared that information with, and I want assurance that no copies exist in locations I cannot control. Joyce let her shoulders slump slightly, projecting the image of a woman who had reached the end of her resources and was ready to surrender. The evidence is hidden in the mine. I can show you where. How convenient. And the copies? There are no copies. I never had the chance to make any before all this started. Zachary studied her face with the intensity of a man who had built his fortune on the ability to detect lies and exploit weaknesses. You know, Mrs. Mitchell, I find that very difficult to believe. A woman with your background, your training in legal procedures, would surely understand the importance of maintaining multiple copies of crucial evidence. Joyce forced herself to meet his gaze directly, drawing on every acting skill she had ever possessed. My background is cooking and household management. I do not know what you think I am, but you are wrong. Am I? Zachary's smile was cold and knowing. Quote 723. The revelation hit Joyce like a physical blow, but she forced herself to maintain her composure. If Zachary knew her real identity, if he understood her true capabilities, then the entire dynamic of their confrontation had shifted. But 724, she said, but even she could hear the weakness in her own voice. Quote 725 Almon. Joyce felt the careful structure of lies she had built around her new identity crumbling like a house built on sand. But with the collapse came a strange sense of relief. The freedom that came from no longer having to maintain a pretense that had grown increasingly difficult to sustain. Quote 726, she said quietly. 1127, quote to 728, Zachary replied. Quote to 729. Joyce glanced toward Lisa and Samuel, who were still standing on the porch under the watchful eyes of Zachary's gunman. The young woman's face showed confusion at the revelations about Joyce's identity, but her expression remained determined. What do you want me to do? Joyce asked. First, you are going to show me where the evidence is hidden. Then you are going to help me identify every document, every piece of correspondence, every scrap of paper that could potentially be used against me or my associates. And then you are going to watch while I burn it all. And after that, Zachary's smile widened, revealing teeth that were too white and too perfect. Quote 733. Joyce nodded slowly as if accepting the inevitable, but her mind was racing through possibilities, looking for any advantage she could exploit in the situation that was developing. Quote to 734, she asked. Quote to 735. Quote to 736, Zachary considered the request, his pale eyes reflecting the calculation of a man who understood the value of leverage. Quote to 737. Joyce turned toward the mine entrance, acutely aware of the gunmen who were positioning themselves to escort her. She could feel Kenneth's eyes on her from somewhere in the forest, could imagine his frustration at being forced to watch while she walked deeper into danger. But she also understood that this was their best chance to gather the intelligence they needed to mount a rescue operation for Marshal Davis. If she could determine where the marshal was being held, if she could create an opportunity for Kenneth to act, then her sacrifice might accomplish something meaningful. The evidence is in the main shaft, Joyce said, beginning to walk toward the mine entrance, hidden in a chamber about 200 feet down. How convenient that it happens to be in the most dangerous part of the mine, Zachary observed, almost as if someone wanted to make it difficult to retrieve. Kenneth was being careful. He knew that people might come looking for it eventually. They reached the mine entrance, a dark opening in the mountainside that was reinforced with heavy timbers and equipped with the basic safety equipment required for underground work. Joyce had been down into these shafts several times with Kenneth, but always with proper lighting and safety precautions. After you, Zachary said, gesturing toward the entrance. Joyce picked up one of the oil lamps that Kenneth kept near the entrance, lighting it with practiced movements that she hoped would reinforce her image as someone familiar with mining operations. The warm glow of the flame pushed back the darkness, revealing the rough-hewn walls and timber supports that marked the beginning of Kenneth's underground empire. Quote 744, she asked as they began to descend. Quote 745, Zachary replied. Quote 746, quote 747, quote 748. Joyce considered the question as they moved deeper into the mine, the sound of their footsteps echoing strangely in the confined space. It was a fair question, one that she had asked herself many times over the past few months. She said finally, the casual cruelty of the comment made Joyce's hands clench into fists, but she forced herself to remain calm. I stayed because I found people who were willing to fight for what was right, even when it was dangerous. How noble, and how foolish. They had reached the main chamber of the mine, a large space where several tunnels branched off in different directions. Joyce paused, as if trying to remember which passage led to the hidden evidence, while actually listening for any sounds that might indicate where other people were located in the underground complex. This way, she said finally, choosing the tunnel that led toward the chamber where the evidence was actually hidden. As they moved deeper into the mine, Joyce became increasingly aware of how isolated they were from any possible rescue. Kenneth might be able to track them this far, but the underground passages offered countless opportunities for ambush and no easy routes of escape. But isolation also meant opportunity. If she could create enough of a distraction, if she could somehow separate Zachary from his bodyguards, she might be able to turn the tables on her captor. Tell me about the evidence, Zachary said as they walked. What exactly did my late wife manage to gather before her unfortunate death? Financial records mostly, correspondence between you and government contractors, documentation of bribes and illegal arrangements. Anything else? Joyce hesitated, as if reluctant to reveal information that might make her situation worse. There were witness statements, people who had seen things, heard conversations, knew about activities that were supposed to be secret. Zachary stopped walking. His attention suddenly focused with laser intensity. What kind of witness statements? Minors who had been threatened to keep quiet about safety violations. Government officials who had been approached with offers of money in exchange for favorable rulings. People who knew about the arrangements you made with certain contractors. Names, Zachary demanded. I want names. They are all in the documents. Sarah Bailey was very thorough in her record-keeping. They had reached the chamber where the evidence was hidden, a natural cavern that Kenneth had expanded and reinforced to create a secure storage area. Joyce moved to the concealed cache, her hands trembling slightly as she worked to open the waterproof containers. Here, she said, lifting out the first bundle of documents. This is what you have been looking for. Zachary took the papers with hands that were steadier than her own, his pale eyes scanning the contents with the speed and comprehension of someone who understood exactly what he was looking at. Impressive, he said after a moment. Sarah Bailey was even more thorough than I gave her credit for. These documents could indeed cause significant problems for my operation. Then you have what you wanted, Joyce said. You can destroy them and eliminate the threat they represent. Oh, I intend to destroy them, Zachary replied. But first, I need to know who else has seen these documents. Who else might have copies or might have memorized crucial information? Joyce shook her head. No one else has seen them. Kenneth and I were the only ones who knew where they were hidden. What about the federal marshals? Surely you shared some of this information with them when they arrived to investigate my operations? The question revealed a crucial piece of information that Joyce filed away for future use. If Zachary was worried about what the federal marshals knew, it meant that his escape from custody had not eliminated the federal investigation entirely. Marshal Davis saw some of the documents, Joyce admitted, but not all of them. We did not have time to go through everything before the shooting started. Zachary's expression darkened. Quote 776, quote 7717, Joyce corrected. Quote 778. Joyce realized that Zachary was constructing a narrative that would justify his actions to whatever authorities might eventually investigate the situation. In his version of events, the federal marshals were the aggressors, and everything that followed was simply self-defense and the protection of legitimate business interests. Quote 779. Joyce asked again. Zachary studied her face for a long moment, apparently weighing the risks and benefits of revealing information that might be used against him. Quote set bars, quote sons, quote added. Joyce understood the implicit threat. Marshal Davis would remain alive only as long as he served Zachary's purposes. Once those purposes were fulfilled, the federal officer would be eliminated along with everyone else who posed a threat to the criminal network. I have cooperated, Joyce pointed out. I showed you where the evidence was hidden. I answered your questions about what the documents contain. What more do you want? I want you to help me identify every person who might have knowledge that could be used against my organization. Every witness, every potential informant, every loose end that needs to be tied up. The request was chilling in its implications. Zachary was not just planning to destroy evidence and eliminate immediate threats. He was planning a systematic purge of anyone who might be able to testify against his network, a campaign of murder that would reach far beyond the immediate participants in this confrontation. I cannot give you information I do not have, Joyce said, but you can help me identify what information exists and where it might be found. You understand legal procedures. You know how evidence is gathered and preserved. You can help me ensure that nothing is overlooked. Joyce realized that Zachary was offering her a choice that was not really a choice at all. She could cooperate in identifying targets for elimination, or she could refuse and watch while innocent people died because she had failed to provide information that might have saved them. But there was a third option, one that was dangerous but might offer the only real chance of stopping Zachary's plans. If she could convince him that she was willing to cooperate fully, if she could gain his trust and access to information about his operations, she might be able to gather intelligence that could be used to bring down his entire network. She said quietly. Zachary considered the request, his pale eyes reflecting the calculation of a man who understood the value of appearing reasonable while maintaining absolute control, he said finally. As they prepared to leave the mine chamber, Joyce took one last look at the evidence cache that had represented so much hope and so much danger. The documents that Sarah Bailey had died to preserve were now in the hands of the man who had killed her, and the truth they contained might die with them. But Joyce carried other truths now. Knowledge about Zachary's operations and plans that might prove even more valuable than the physical evidence. If she could stay alive long enough to use that knowledge, if she could find a way to communicate it to people who could act on it, then Sarah Bailey's sacrifice might still accomplish its intended purpose. The question was whether she would live long enough to make that possible. The journey back to the surface felt like ascending from hell into purgatory, trading the claustrophobic darkness of the mine for the cold gray light of a mountain winter that held its own forms of danger. Joyce walked ahead of Zachary and his two bodyguards, acutely aware of the weapons trained on her back and the precarious nature of her temporary value to their operation. When they emerged from the mine entrance, Joyce saw that the situation in the clearing had evolved during their absence. More men had arrived. At least 6 additional gunmen who had positioned themselves around the perimeter in a defensive formation that suggested they were expecting trouble from multiple directions. Lisa Scott and Samuel Chen were still on the porch, but they had been joined by 2 other people Joyce did not immediately recognize. As they drew closer, she realized with a sinking heart that the newcomers were Thomas Rodriguez and Marcus Webb, the men who had volunteered to help set up communications with federal authorities. Both men showed signs of rough treatment, their clothes torn and their faces bearing the marks of violence. They were alive, but barely, and their presence here meant that the attempt to contact outside help had failed completely. Zachary observed with satisfaction. Quote 795I, quote 7961, Joyce asked, though she dreaded the answer. Quote 7971, the lie was smoothly delivered, wrapped in just enough legal language to sound plausible to anyone who did not understand the real situation. Joyce realized that Zachary was continuing to construct his narrative, creating a story that would justify his actions to whatever authorities might eventually investigate. Quote 798 and one of Zachary's lieutenants asked, destroyed along with any messages they might have attempted to send, Zachary replied. We cannot have unauthorized communications disrupting legitimate law enforcement activities. Joyce felt a spark of hope at the phrasing. If Zachary was worried about messages that might have been sent, it suggested that the telegraph might have been operational long enough to transmit at least some information before being discovered. What about the federal marshals? The lieutenant continued. When are we expecting them to return? Marshal Davis will not be returning, Zachary said with cold finality. His investigation has been concluded, and his findings will be reported through appropriate channels. The casual announcement of what amounted to a death sentence sent a chill through Joyce that had nothing to do with the mountain air. If Zachary was already speaking of Marshal Davis in the past tense, it meant the federal officer's time was running out rapidly. Joyce said, quote 806. Zachary turned to study her face, his pale eyes reflecting something that might have been amusement. Quote 807. Quote 809. The words were spoken with the same casual tone Zachary might use to discuss the weather, but their implications were crystal clear. Joyce had outlived her usefulness, and her execution was now simply a matter of timing and convenience. But as she looked around the clearing, taking in the positions of Zachary's men and the layout of the surrounding terrain, Joyce realized that she was not the only person whose life hung in the balance. Lisa Scott, Samuel Chen, Thomas Rodriguez, and Marcus Webb were all witnesses to Zachary's crimes, all potential sources of testimony that could threaten his network. None of them would be allowed to leave this mountain alive. The realization brought with it a strange sense of clarity, a freedom that came from understanding that she had nothing left to lose. If death was inevitable, regardless of what choices she made, then she might as well make choices that could accomplish something meaningful. Code 18, Joyce said quietly. Code on. Zachary's eyebrows rose slightly. Explain. The evidence you found in the mine, the documents Sarah Bailey gathered, they represent only part of the threat to your operation. The real danger comes from what people know, what they have seen and heard and experienced firsthand, which is why we are taking steps to address those concerns. By killing everyone who might be able to testify against you, that might solve your immediate problem, but it creates much larger ones. Zachary's expression grew more attentive, his businessman's instincts recognizing that Joyce might be offering information of value. Continue. 5 people disappearing from a small mountain community will attract attention, especially when one of them is a federal marshal. There will be investigations, searches, questions that lead to more questions. Tragic accidents happen in mountain country. Mining is a dangerous profession, and winter weather can be unforgiving to the unprepared. Joyce shook her head. That might work for 1 or 2 people, but not for 5. And not when there are already federal investigators asking questions about corruption and illegal activities. The federal investigation died with Marshal Davis. Did it? Are you certain that Davis was working alone, that he did not report his findings to superiors, that there are not other agents already en route to continue his work? For the first time since his arrival, Zachary looked uncertain. The question Joyce had raised struck at the heart of his assumptions about the federal investigation and the extent of outside knowledge about his activities. "What do you know about federal procedures?" he asked. "I know that Marshal Davis would not have come here alone, without backup plans and communication protocols. I know that federal investigations of this scope involve multiple agents and coordination with other agencies." Joyce was improvising, drawing on her general knowledge of law enforcement procedures and hoping that her confidence would convince Zachary that she possessed specific information about the federal operation. "Even if that were true," Zachary said slowly, "eliminating the witnesses and evidence would still be the logical course of action." Would it? Or would it be smarter to control the witnesses, to manage the information they possess, to use them to feed false intelligence to federal investigators? The suggestion was audacious, but Joyce could see that it had captured Zachary's attention. The idea of turning potential witnesses into unwilling accomplices appealed to his manipulative nature and his preference for controlling situations rather than simply destroying them. Quote 827 to one of Zachary's lieutenants asked, "I am suggesting that dead martyrs often cause more problems than living prisoners," Joyce replied, "especially when those prisoners can be used to discredit federal investigations and protect legitimate business interests." Zachary was quiet for a long moment, his pale eyes reflecting the complexity of the decision he faced. Joyce could see him weighing the risks and benefits of her proposal, calculating the potential advantages of a more sophisticated approach to managing the crisis. "Interesting," he said finally, "but it would require a level of control and coordination that might be difficult to maintain over time. Not if it were done correctly. Not if the witnesses understood that their continued survival depended on their cooperation and their ability to provide useful intelligence about federal activities." Joyce was walking a dangerous line, offering herself and the others as assets rather than liabilities, while hoping to buy enough time for Kenneth to mount some kind of rescue operation. But she also understood that her proposal might actually appeal to Zachary's ego and his desire to demonstrate his superiority over federal law enforcement. "Quote 833, Zachary asked, quote 834, quote 85. Zachary gestured toward the prisoners on the porch, quote 86, quote 87. Joyce was improvising desperately, trying to create value for people whose only crime had been a willingness to help others. But she could see that Zachary was considering the proposal seriously, his businessman's instincts recognizing the potential advantages of a more nuanced approach. "And what about you, Miss Morgan? What unique value do you bring to this arrangement?" "I understand legal procedures, federal jurisdiction, the kind of evidence that prosecutors need to build cases. I can help you anticipate federal moves and develop countermeasures that go beyond simply eliminating witnesses." Zachary nodded slowly, his decision apparently made. "Very well. We will try your approach, at least initially. But understand that the moment any of you cease to be useful, the moment you become more of a liability than an asset, we will revert to more permanent solutions." Joyce felt a wave of relief that was immediately tempered by the understanding that she had simply traded immediate execution for a more prolonged form of danger. But time was what they needed most. Time for Kenneth to develop a plan, time for federal reinforcements to arrive, time for something to change in their favor. "Where will we be held?" she asked. "There is a facility about 10 miles from here, originally built as a mining camp, but now serving other purposes. You will be comfortable there, as long as you remain cooperative." Joyce understood that the facility was probably the location where Marshall Davis was being held, which meant that her gambit might accomplish the objective of reuniting the prisoners and creating opportunities for coordinated resistance. "When do we leave?" she asked. "Immediately. The longer we remain here, the greater the chance that federal agents might arrive to complicate the situation." As Zachary's men began preparing for departure, Joyce caught Lisa Scott's eye and saw a mixture of confusion and hope in the young woman's expression. Lisa did not understand the game Joyce was playing, but she recognized that something had changed, that the immediate threat of execution had been replaced by something more complex and potentially survivable. Joyce also noticed that none of Zachary's men were paying attention to the forest around the clearing, their focus entirely on managing the prisoners and preparing for travel. If Kenneth was still out there, if he was planning some kind of intervention, this might be his best opportunity. But as the minutes passed and no rescue materialized, Joyce realized that she and the others were truly on their own. Whatever happened next, whatever choices they made, and whatever consequences they faced would depend entirely on their own courage and resourcefulness. The journey to Zachary's, quote, 846 Sarawang was about to begin, and with it, the next phase of a game where the stakes were nothing less than life and death. The ride through the mountain forest felt like a funeral procession, with Joyce and the other prisoners mounted on horses that were led by Zachary's men rather than controlled by the riders themselves. The precaution ensured that escape attempts would be difficult, if not impossible, while maintaining the illusion that they were voluntary participants in whatever was about to unfold. Joyce found herself positioned near the middle of the column, close enough to Lisa Scott to exchange occasional glances, but far enough from the other prisoners to prevent any meaningful communication. Zachary rode at the front, his attention divided between the trail ahead and periodic consultations with his lieutenants about security arrangements and contingency plans. The facility they were approaching had been described as a former mining camp, but as they crested a ridge and Joyce caught her first glimpse of their destination, she realized that the description was both accurate and misleading. The buildings below were indeed arranged in the pattern typical of mining operations, but they had been modified and fortified in ways that suggested a very different current purpose. High fences topped with barbed wire surrounded the central compound, and Joyce could see guards positioned at regular intervals around the perimeter. This was not simply a remote hideout or temporary holding facility, but a permanent installation designed to hold prisoners and conduct activities that required complete isolation from outside observation. "Impressive, is it not?" Zachary said, guiding his horse closer to Joyce's mount. Quote 840, quote 849, Joyce asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Quota 850. Joyce understood the euphemism. For 2 years, Zachary had been kidnapping, imprisoning, and probably murdering people who posed threats to his criminal network. The facility below represented a systematic approach to eliminating opposition, one that went far beyond the crude violence typically associated with frontier crime. Quote 851, she asked. Zachary's smile was cold and knowing. "Enough to refine our procedures and establish effective protocols. You and your friends will benefit from that experience." As they descended toward the compound, Joyce could see more details of the facility's layout and security arrangements. The main building appeared to be a converted mining office, probably serving as headquarters for whatever operations were conducted here. Smaller structures were arranged around the perimeter, some clearly designed as living quarters, while others might serve as workshops or storage areas. But it was the building at the center of the compound that drew Joyce's attention and filled her with dread. It was windowless and heavily reinforced, its design suggesting that it was intended to hold people who were not expected to leave voluntarily. "Is that where Marshall Davis is being held?" she asked. "Marshall Davis is being held in accommodations appropriate to his status as a federal officer," Zachary replied, "though I suspect his current perspective on law enforcement has evolved considerably since his arrival." The casual cruelty of the comment made Joyce's stomach clench, but she forced herself to remain calm. If Davis was still alive, if he was being held in that central building, then her gambit might have accomplished its primary objective of locating the missing federal officer. The gates of the compound opened as they approached, operated by guards who clearly recognized Zachary and his party. Joyce noted the professional bearing of the security personnel. their military-style equipment and disciplined positioning around the entrance. These were not local thugs or desperate criminals, but trained professionals who understood their role in a larger operation. The realization made escape seem even more unlikely, but it also suggested that whatever was happening here was part of a network that extended far beyond Zachary's immediate criminal enterprise. "Welcome to your new home," Zachary said as they entered the compound. "I trust you will find the accommodations adequate for your needs." Joyce and the other prisoners were dismounted and escorted toward one of the smaller building bungs, their hand bound behind their backs with rope that was tight enough to prevent escape, but not so tight as to cause permanent injury. The attention to detail suggested that their captors had considerable experience in managing prisoners. The building they entered had been converted into a holding area with multiple cells separated by iron bars. Each cell contained basic furnishings, a cot, a small table, and a bucket for sanitary needs, but no windows or other features that might facilitate escape attempts. Joyce found herself assigned to a cell next to Lisa Scott, with Samuel Chen and the others placed in adjacent compartments where they could see and hear each other but could not coordinate physical actions. The arrangement was clearly designed to maintain morale while preventing organized resistance. "Mrs. Mitchell," Lisa whispered once their guards had withdrawn, "what is happening? What did you tell them to convince them not to kill us?" Joyce moved closer to the bars that separated their cells, keeping her voice low to avoid attracting attention from any guards who might be listening. "I convinced them that we might be more useful alive than dead, at least temporarily." "How?" "By offering to help them anticipate and counter federal investigations, by suggesting that we could provide intelligence about law enforcement procedures and local conditions." Samuel Chen leaned forward in his own cell, his weathered face showing both hope and concern. "Do you really think we can provide that kind of information?" "I think we can pretend to provide it long enough to figure out how to escape or how to signal for help," Joyce replied. "The important thing is to stay alive while we look for opportunities." Thomas Rodriguez spoke up from the cell furthest from the entrance. "What about Marshall Davis? Have you seen any sign of him?" "Not yet, but I think he is being held in the central building. If we can find a way to reach him, if we can coordinate our efforts, we might have a better chance of getting out of this." Marcus Webb, the former soldier, had been examining the construction of their cells with professional interest. "These bars are solid iron, set deep into stone foundations. The locks are military grade, probably salvaged from a federal installation. Breaking out of here would require tools we do not have and time we probably will not get." Joyce nodded, having reached similar conclusions about the physical security of their prison. "Then we need to focus on other options. Information gathering, building relationships with guards, looking for weaknesses in their procedures." "You mean we actually cooperate with them?" Lisa asked, her voice carrying a note of horror. "I mean, we appear to cooperate while we gather intelligence and look for opportunities to turn the tables," Joyce replied. "These people are criminals, but they are not stupid. If we are going to outwit them, we need to understand how they think and how they operate." The sound of approaching footsteps made them all fall silent. A moment later, the door to their holding area opened, and Zachary entered, accompanied by two guards and a man Joyce had not seen before. The newcomer was older than Zachary, perhaps 60, with silver hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to command. His clothes were expensive but practical, and his pale eyes held an intelligence that seemed to take in every detail of the scene before him. "Miss Morgan," Zachary said, "I would like you to meet my associate, Colonel William Harrison. He will be overseeing your orientation and training for your new roles in our organization." Joyce felt ice form in her veins as she recognized the name. Colonel Harrison was the territorial administrator who had been present when Marshall Davis was shot. The federal official who was supposed to be investigating Zachary's crimes, but was apparently part of the corrupt network instead. "Quote 875, she said carefully. "Quote 876, quote 877. Harrison replied, his voice carrying the authority of someone who was accustomed to having his orders followed without question. "Quote 878, quote 879, quote 880. Joyce felt the world tilt around her as she processed the implications of Harrison's words. If the federal investigation was compromised at the highest levels, if Marshall Davis had been acting without proper authorization, then the cavalry she had been hoping would arrive to rescue them might never come. What kind of national interest, she asked. The kind that required discretion, flexibility, and a willingness to work outside normal legal constraints, Harrison replied. The kind that recognized that sometimes the greater good requires actions that might appear questionable to those who do not understand the larger picture. Joyce realized that she was being recruited, not just as a prisoner who might provide useful information, but as a potential participant in whatever criminal enterprise Zachary and Harrison were operating. The offer was both an opportunity and a trap, one that could provide access to crucial intelligence while potentially making her complicit in crimes she could never justify. And if we refuse to participate? Samuel Chen asked from his cell. Harrison's smile was cold and professional. The threat was clear, but Joyce also heard something else in Harrison's tone, a suggestion that cooperation might offer genuine opportunities rather than simply delayed execution. If she could convince him that she was willing to work with their organization, if she could gain access to information about their operations and objectives, she might be able to gather intelligence that could eventually be used against them. What exactly would our participation involve, she asked. That depends on your individual skills and the specific needs of our organization, Harrison replied. Miss Scott, for example, has extensive knowledge of local conditions and community relationships that could be valuable for future operations in this area. And the others? Mr. Chen has experience in mining operations that could be useful for evaluating potential acquisitions. Mr. Rodriguez has contacts in territorial government that might provide access to information we need. Mr. Webb has military experience that could be applied to security and logistics challenges. Joyce understood that Harrison was offering each of them a role that would exploit their existing knowledge and skills while making them complicit in criminal activities. It was a sophisticated approach to recruitment, one that recognized the value of willing participants over unwilling prisoners. What about Marshall Davis, she asked. What role does he play in your organization? Harrison's expression grew more serious. Quote 893, quote 89, quote 895. Joyce realized that Davis was being held as leverage, his life dependent on their willingness to participate in whatever Harrison and Zachary were planning. But she also understood that their cooperation would not guarantee the Marshal's survival, only delay his eventual elimination. I need time to consider your offer, she said. Of course, but not too much time. We have operations scheduled that will require your participation, and delays could create complications for everyone involved. As Harrison and Zachary prepared to leave, Joyce caught the older man's attention with a direct question that she hoped would provide crucial intelligence. Harrison's pause was barely perceptible, but Joyce caught it and understood its significance. Mr. Thornton suffered an unfortunate accident when he began investigating matters that were beyond his jurisdiction and his understanding. You had him killed. I had a problem solved in the most efficient manner available, just as I will solve the current problem if necessary. The admission was chilling in its casualness, but it also confirmed what Joyce had suspected about the scope and reach of the criminal network she was facing. These people had been eliminating threats and obstacles for years, operating with the kind of resources and protection that suggested involvement at the highest levels of territorial and federal government. As the door closed behind their captors, Joyce found herself alone with her fellow prisoners and the weight of decisions that would determine not just their own fate, but potentially the fate of everyone who had tried to oppose Zachary's criminal empire. The game had changed again, and the stakes had never been higher. Night fell over the compound like a shroud, bringing with it a silence that was broken only by the measured footsteps of guards making their rounds and the distant howl of wolves somewhere in the surrounding forest. Joyce lay on the narrow cot in her cell, staring up at the rough wooden ceiling and trying to process everything that had happened since their arrival at what Harrison had euphemistically called their new home. The other prisoners had fallen into an exhausted sleep, their breathing providing a steady rhythm that was somehow comforting in the alien environment of their imprisonment. But Joyce's mind was too active for rest, racing through possibilities and contingencies as she tried to develop some kind of plan that might offer hope of escape or rescue. The conversation with Colonel Harrison had revealed the true scope of the conspiracy they were facing. This was not simply a local corruption scheme involving mining rights and territorial officials, but a network that reached into the highest levels of federal government and had the resources to eliminate threats with professional efficiency. Richard Thornton's death had not been an accident, just as Sarah Bailey's death had not been natural causes. Both had been murdered because they had stumbled onto evidence of criminal activities that threatened powerful people with significant resources and no moral constraints on their actions. But the revelation also suggested opportunities that Joyce had not previously considered. If the network was as extensive as Harrison had implied, if it involved federal officials and government contractors, then it was vulnerable to exposure in ways that purely local corruption would not be. The sound of a door opening somewhere in the building brought Joyce fully alert. Footsteps approached their cell area, but they were different from the heavy boots of the guards who had been checking on them throughout the evening. These steps were lighter, more cautious, suggesting someone who was trying to avoid detection. A figure appeared in the doorway, silhouetted against the dim light from the corridor beyond. Joyce could not make out details, but something about the person's bearing suggested familiarity rather than threat. The voice was barely above a whisper, but Joyce recognized it immediately. Quote 903, she replied, keeping her own voice low to avoid waking the others. Quote 904, Davis said, moving closer to her cell. Quote 905. Joyce could see him more clearly now, and the sight made her heart sink. The federal marshal was alive, but barely. His face was bruised and swollen, his clothes torn and stained with blood. He moved with the careful deliberation of someone who was fighting through significant pain. Quote 906 found, Joyce asked. Quote 907 found. Joyce understood immediately. Davis was not here as a fellow prisoner seeking to coordinate escape plans, but as an unwilling participant in Harrison's psychological manipulation. His appearance was designed to demonstrate the consequences of resistance while offering the illusion of mercy for those who chose cooperation. What did they do to you? She asked. Nothing permanent yet, but they have made it clear that my continued health depends on your willingness to participate in their operations. The words confirmed what Joyce had already suspected about the leverage being used against her and the others. Davis was not just a prisoner, but a hostage whose life would be forfeit if they refused to cooperate with Harrison's plans. Joyce asked, quote 911. Quote 912, Davis was quiet for a moment, his battered face reflecting the complexity of the situation they faced. Quote 913. Joyce understood the implicit threat beneath the promises. Participation would make them complicit in criminal activities, creating legal vulnerabilities that would ensure their continued cooperation, even if they eventually had opportunities to escape. Quote 914, she asked. What 915 tone? Joyce moved closer to the bars of her cell, lowering her voice even further as she shared the plan that had been forming in her mind throughout the long evening. Quote 916, Davis nodded slowly. Quote 917 bound. Quote 918 bound. Quote 919 bound. Joyce filed away the information, adding it to her mental map of the compound and its vulnerabilities. If they were going to attempt an escape, they would need weapons and a way to neutralize the guards without raising an alarm that would bring reinforcements. Quote 920, quote, she asked. Davis's expression grew grim. I have seen at least a dozen other prisoners, maybe more. Some appear to have been here for months, possibly years. They are being used for various purposes, labor, intelligence gathering, specialized skills that the organization needs. The revelation was horrifying, but not entirely surprising. Joyce had suspected that this facility represented more than a temporary holding area for immediate threats. It was a systematic operation for exploiting human resources in service of criminal enterprises. Are any of the other prisoners potential allies? People who might be willing to help with an escape attempt? Difficult to say. Some appear to have been broken by their experiences here, willing to do anything to avoid further punishment. Others seem to be biding their time, waiting for opportunities that may never come. Joyce understood the psychological dynamics Davis was describing. Long-term imprisonment under these conditions would create complex relationships between captors and prisoners, with some people adapting through compliance, while others maintained resistance despite the personal costs. What about outside help? Are there federal agents looking for you, people who know where you went and when you were supposed to report back? Davis hesitated before answering, and Joyce could see the conflict in his expression. The situation is complicated. I was operating with limited authority when I came to Cedar Ridge, following leads that my superiors considered speculative at best. What does that mean? It means that if I disappear, if I fail to report back, it might be attributed to the dangers of working alone in remote territory rather than to criminal activity. Joyce felt her heart sink as she processed the implications. If Davis had been operating without full federal backing, if his investigation had been unofficial or unauthorized, then rescue from outside sources was even less likely than she had feared. "How long before they expect you to make a decision about cooperation?" she asked. "Tomorrow morning. Harrison wants an answer from both of us about our willingness to participate in their next operation." "What kind of operation?" Davis glanced around nervously, as if afraid that their conversation might be overheard despite the precautions they were taking. "They are planning to eliminate several territorial officials who have been asking inconvenient questions about mining rights and federal contracts. They want you to help them identify the legal vulnerabilities of their targets, and they want me to provide intelligence about federal law enforcement procedures." The scope of what Harrison was planning hit Joyce like a physical blow. This was not simply about covering up past crimes or eliminating immediate threats, but about systematically murdering government officials who pose obstacles to their criminal network. "We cannot participate in that," she said firmly. "I know, but if we refuse, they will kill us and find other ways to accomplish their objectives." Joyce understood the impossible position they were in. Cooperation meant becoming complicit in mass murder, while resistance meant certain death and no guarantee that their sacrifice would prevent the crimes from being committed. "There has to be another way," she said. "If there is, we need to find it quickly. I do not think Harrison will accept delays much longer." The sound of approaching footsteps made both of them fall silent. A guard appeared in the doorway, his rifle held ready, and his expression suggesting that the conversation was over. "Time to go, Marshal," the guard said. "Colonel Harrison wants to see you again." Davis rose slowly, his movements revealing the extent of his injuries. As he prepared to leave, he caught Joyce's eye and spoke in a voice that was intended to carry to the other prisoners, who were now stirring in their cells. Quote 938. Joyce understood the double meaning in his words. On the surface, he was encouraging her to consider Harrison's recruitment offer seriously, but underneath he was warning her that their window for resistance was closing rapidly, and that whatever they were going to do would need to happen soon. As Davis was escorted away, Joyce found herself alone with her fellow prisoners and the weight of decisions that would determine not just their own survival, but potentially the lives of countless others who would suffer if Harrison's criminal network continued to operate with impunity. The night stretched ahead of them, offering perhaps their last opportunity to develop a plan that might offer some hope of escape or resistance. But with dawn would come demands for answers, and with those answers would come consequences that none of them might survive. Joyce closed her eyes and tried to find the strength that had carried her through months of hardship and danger. Somewhere in the darkness, she could hear the distant sound of wind moving through the pine trees that surrounded the compound, a reminder of the world beyond these walls and the freedom that seemed increasingly beyond their reach. But she was not ready to surrender yet. Not to Harrison, not to Zachary, not to the corrupt system that had already claimed too many innocent lives. If tomorrow brought demands for cooperation and mass murder, then tomorrow would also bring her answer. And that answer would be delivered not in words, but in actions that might finally tip the balance in favor of justice over corruption, truth over lies, and hope over despair. Dawn came too soon and too gray, filtering through the small window high in the wall of their prison like weak tea poured through dirty cloth. Joyce had managed perhaps 2 hours of fitful sleep, her mind too active and her body too tense to find real rest. Around her, the other prisoners were stirring, their movements stiff and cautious as they adjusted to another day of captivity. The sound of multiple footsteps in the corridor announced the arrival of their captors before the door opened to reveal Colonel Harrison, accompanied by Zachary Nelson and 4 armed guards. Harrison's expression was businesslike and impatient, suggesting that the time for negotiation and psychological manipulation had passed. Good morning, Harrison said, his tone carrying the false courtesy of someone who held absolute power over his audience. I trust you all had time to consider the opportunities we discussed yesterday. Joyce exchanged glances with Lisa Scott and the others, seeing her own determination reflected in their faces. Whatever they had decided individually during the long night, they were united now in their understanding of what was at stake. We have considered your offer, Joyce said, rising from her cot to face Harrison directly, and we have some questions about the specific nature of our proposed participation. Harrison's eyebrows rose slightly, perhaps surprised by her apparent willingness to engage in detailed negotiations. Quote 943, quote 944, quote 945 Harrison replied, quote 946. Joyce felt her stomach clench at the casual way Harrison discussed mass murder, but she forced herself to maintain an expression of professional interest. Quote 947 mood, quote 948, quote 949, quote 950. Joyce nodded as if the plan made perfect sense, while her mind raced through the implications and possibilities it presented. If Harrison was planning to move against 7 territorial officials within 2 weeks, it meant that his organization had the resources and coordination to mount a sophisticated campaign of assassination. But it also meant that they had a specific timeline and target list, information that could be used against them if it reached the right people. Quote 951, Joyce said. Quote 952, quote off 3, quote. Harrison's smile was cold but apparently genuine. Miss Morgan, you are thinking like a lawyer rather than a criminal. In our business, guarantees are provided through mutual dependence rather than written contracts. Meaning that once you participate in these operations, you will be as vulnerable to prosecution as we are. Your survival will depend on our continued success, just as our success will depend on your continued cooperation. Joyce understood the trap that Harrison was describing. Participation would make them complicit in capital crimes, creating legal vulnerabilities that would ensure their loyalty, even if they eventually had opportunities to escape or betray the organization. I see, she said. And if we refuse to participate, then you will be transferred to less comfortable accommodations while we implement alternative plans. Your refusal would be disappointing, but not necessarily fatal to our objectives. The threat was clear, but Joyce also heard something else in Harrison's tone that gave her hope. If their participation was valuable but not essential, it meant that Harrison preferred willing cooperation over forced compliance. That preference might create opportunities for negotiation and misdirection. Quote 961, Joyce said. Quote 962. Harrison checked his pocket watch, his expression suggesting that patience was not unlimited. Quote 963. As Harrison and his escorts prepared to leave, Joyce made a decision that was risky but potentially crucial to any escape plan they might develop. She called out. Harrison paused, his attention focused on her with renewed interest. Quote 966 or quote 967. Harrison's expression grew more serious. What kind of evidence? Communications equipment that had been used to contact federal authorities? Reconnaissance activities that suggested organized surveillance of your operations? References to ongoing investigations that extend beyond what Marshal Davis was conducting? Joyce was improvising, drawing on fragments of truth and reasonable speculation to create the impression that Harrison's organization faced threats he might not be aware of. If she could convince him that federal agents were already closing in, it might create opportunities for confusion and misdirection. Quote 970, Harrison asked. Quote 971. Harrison was quiet for a long moment, his pale eyes reflecting the calculation of a man who understood the importance of accurate intelligence in planning complex operations. He said finally, Joyce was walking a dangerous line, providing enough detail to make her claims seem credible while avoiding specifics that could be easily verified or disproven. But she could see that Harrison was taking her warning seriously, recognizing the potential implications for his organization. Good 975, Harrison said. Quote 976, quote 97. Harrison nodded slowly, apparently accepting the logic of her argument. Quote Gentiehi. As the door closed behind their captors, Joyce found herself facing the expectant faces of her fellow prisoners. They had heard enough of the conversation to understand the stakes, but they were looking to her for guidance about how to proceed. Quote 979. Lisa Scott asked quietly. Quote 980. Joyce replied. Quote 981. Samuel Chen leaned forward in his cell. Quote 982. Quote 983. Joyce said. Quote 984. Thomas Rodriguez spoke up from his cell. Quote 985. And Joyce had been wrestling with that same concern throughout the night. Davis's life was being held hostage to ensure their cooperation, but participating in mass murder was not acceptable, regardless of the personal costs. Davis understood the risks when he chose to investigate these people. Which, she said finally, he would not want us to become complicit in murder to save his life. Are you sure about that? Marcus Webb asked. Are you willing to bet his life on your interpretation of what he would want? The question struck at the heart of Joyce's moral dilemma. She was making life and death decisions for other people based on principles and assumptions that might not reflect their actual preferences. But she also understood that some choices could not be avoided, regardless of their personal costs. She said. Lisa Scott nodded slowly. Quote 992, quote 993. Samuel Chen asked. Joyce looked around at the faces of her fellow prisoners, seeing fear and determination in equal measure. They were ordinary people who had been thrust into an extraordinary situation, forced to make choices that would define not just their own character, but potentially the fate of many others. Joyce said. Webb asked. Quote 997. The hour that Harrison had given them was passing quickly, and Joyce could hear sounds of activity elsewhere in the compound that suggested preparations were underway for whatever operations were being planned. If they were going to act, if they were going to find some way to resist or escape, it would need to happen soon. But as she looked at the determined faces around her, Joyce felt a spark of hope that had been absent during the darkest moments of their captivity. They were not alone in this fight, and they were not powerless despite their circumstances. Whatever came next, they would face it together with the knowledge that they had chosen principle over convenience, courage over safety, and justice over survival. The final confrontation with Harrison and his criminal network was approaching, and Joyce was ready to meet it with everything she had learned about herself during the long journey from frightened refugee to determined resistance fighter. The hour passed like a season, each minute stretching endlessly as Joyce and her fellow prisoners waited for Harrison's return. The sounds from outside their holding area had intensified, suggesting that significant preparations were underway for whatever operations the criminal organization was planning. When the door finally opened, Harrison entered alone, except for two guards who positioned themselves near the entrance. His expression was grimmer than it had been during their earlier encounter, and Joyce sensed that something had changed in the intervening time. I have received some disturbing intelligence, Harrison said without preamble. Intelligence that confirms some of the concerns you raised about federal surveillance of our operations. Joyce felt her pulse quicken, but she kept her expression neutral. What kind of intelligence? Communications intercepts suggesting that federal agents are indeed closer to our operations than we previously believed. References to ongoing investigations, surveillance activities, coordination with territorial authorities. Harrison was confirming information that Joyce had largely invented, which meant either that her speculation had been remarkably accurate or that the colonel was testing her knowledge to determine how much she actually knew. That could complicate your planned operations significantly, Joyce observed. Indeed, which is why I am modifying our timeline and our requirements for your participation. Joyce felt a chill of apprehension. If Harrison was accelerating his plans in response to perceived federal threats, it might mean that their window for resistance or escape was closing even more rapidly than she had feared. What kind of modifications, she asked. The operations against territorial officials will proceed immediately, within the next 48 hours, rather than over the next 2 weeks. And your participation will be more direct and immediate than originally planned. Meaning? Harrison moved closer to her cell, his pale eyes reflecting a cold intensity that made Joyce's skin crawl. Code 5007. The proposal was both terrifying and potentially advantageous. If she could convince Harrison to take her along during the assassination attempts, she might have opportunities to warn the intended victims or sabotage the operations. But it would also put her in direct physical danger, and make her an immediate accomplice to whatever violence occurred. Quote, quantum raid? Joyce asked, quote, Duanon. Joyce understood the arrangement immediately. Harrison was separating them, taking some as operational assets, while holding others as hostages to ensure the cooperation of those in the field. It was a sophisticated approach to managing unwilling participants in criminal activities. The inclusion of Davis in the field operations suggested that Harrison was confident in his ability to control the federal officer, probably through threats against the other prisoners. But it also meant that Davis would have opportunities to act if the right circumstances presented themselves. Darce asked. Quote, Joyce felt her stomach clench as she realized that Harrison was planning to begin his campaign of murder with someone who was particularly vulnerable and isolated. But the remote location might also offer opportunities for escape or resistance that would not exist in more populated areas. Quote, 1014, she asked. Quote, 1015, quote, 1016. Harrison's smile was cold and predatory. Then you will share the consequences along with the rest of the team. Your survival will depend on the success of the mission. Joyce understood that she was being given a choice that was not really a choice at all. Participate in murder or face immediate execution, with no guarantee that cooperation would ensure long-term survival. But the field operation might offer opportunities that imprisonment in this compound would never provide. I will need access to legal reference materials, she said. Books, precedents, case law that might be relevant to making the death appear accidental. That can be arranged. What else? Communication equipment, so I can coordinate with other team members and provide real-time guidance as situations develop. Harrison nodded, apparently accepting the logic of her requests. You will be provided with everything necessary to fulfill your role effectively. As Harrison prepared to leave to make final preparations, Joyce caught his attention with one more question that she hoped would provide crucial intelligence. Colonel, what happens to the other prisoners after these operations are completed? The ones who remain here while we are in the field? That depends on the success of the operations and the level of cooperation we receive from field participants. Success will be rewarded appropriately. Failure will have consequences for everyone involved. The threat was clear, but Joyce also sensed that Harrison was not entirely confident in his ability to control the situation. If federal agents were indeed closer than he had believed, if his organization was under more pressure than he had anticipated, then he might be making decisions based on desperation rather than careful planning. We will be ready to leave when you are, Joyce said. Harrison nodded and left with his guards, leaving the prisoners alone to contemplate the impossible situation they faced. Joyce could see the fear and uncertainty in the faces around her, but also a determination that gave her hope. What are you really planning? Lisa Scott asked once they were sure they would not be overheard. I am planning to find a way to warn the intended victim and sabotage the operation without getting us all killed, Joyce replied. It will not be easy, but it might be our only chance to strike back against these people. Samuel Chen leaned forward in his cell. What if you cannot warn the judge? What if the only choice is between participating in murder and dying yourself? Joyce had been wrestling with that exact question since Harrison's departure. The moral calculus was clear in principle, but agonizing in practice, especially when her choices would affect not just herself, but everyone who depended on her. Quote 1030, she said finally. Code 131, Tama Rodriguez spoke up from his cell. Marcus Webb had been listening to the conversation with the analytical attention of someone who understood tactical situations. Quote 1034, quote 35, Joyce replied. Quote 36, the sound of approaching vehicles carried across the compound, suggesting that the departure time was approaching rapidly. Joyce could feel her heart hammering against her ribs as she contemplated what lay ahead. But underneath the fear was a determination that had been forged in months of hardship and loss. She thought of Kenneth Bailey, somewhere in the mountains, probably organizing some kind of rescue operation despite the impossible odds he faced. She thought of Sarah Bailey, murdered for trying to expose corruption and bring justice to her community. She thought of Richard Thornton, killed for building cases against powerful criminals who believed themselves above the law. All of those people had made choices to fight for what was right, regardless of the personal costs. Now it was her turn to make that same choice, to stand up for principles that mattered more than individual survival. The door to their holding area opened again, and guards entered to escort Joyce, Marcus Webb, and Lisa Scott to whatever vehicles were waiting outside. As they were led away, Joyce caught a last glimpse of Samuel Chen and Thomas Rodriguez, their faces reflecting the same mixture of fear and determination that she felt in her own heart. Whatever happened in the next few hours, whatever choices she made, and whatever consequences she faced, Joyce Mitchell knew that she was finally living up to the woman she had always wanted to be. The frightened refugee who had arrived in Cedar Ridge was gone, replaced by someone who understood that some battles were worth fighting regardless of whether they could be won. The vehicle that would carry her toward her final confrontation with Harrison's criminal network was waiting outside, its engine running and its destination set. But Joyce was no longer simply a passenger in her own life, carried along by forces beyond her control. She was a woman with agency, with purpose, with the skills and determination to fight for justice, even when justice seemed impossible to achieve. And that transformation, more than any external rescue or intervention, would determine the outcome of everything that followed. The vehicle that carried them through the mountain darkness was a military surplus truck, its canvas-covered bed providing concealment for the armed men who accompanied Joyce and the others on their mission of murder. She sat between Marcus Webb and Marshall Davis, acutely aware of the guards who watched their every movement while the truck navigated the winding mountain roads toward their destination. Davis looked worse than he had during their brief conversation the night before, his face bearing fresh bruises that suggested he had been subjected to additional persuasion during the intervening hours. But his eyes remained alert and focused, and Joyce sensed that he was looking for opportunities just as she was. Colonel Harrison rode in the passenger seat of the truck, occasionally consulting a map and communicating with other vehicles through a military radio. The operation was clearly well-planned and coordinated, with multiple teams moving simultaneously toward their respective targets. "The judge's cabin is about 5 miles ahead," Harrison called back to them. "We will stop a mile short to finalize our approach and review the specific procedures." Joyce nodded, though her mind was racing through possibilities for warning the intended victim or sabotaging the operation. The remote location worked against them in some ways, limiting opportunities for outside intervention, but it also meant fewer witnesses and complications if they could find a way to turn the tables on their captors. "What do we know about the judge's security arrangements?" Marcus Webb asked, playing his assigned role as tactical advisor. "Minimal," one of the guards replied. "He lives alone. No permanent security detail. Probably just a hunting rifle for protection against wildlife." Joyce felt a surge of anger at the casual way these men discussed the murder of an innocent official whose only crime had been doing his job with integrity. But she forced herself to maintain a professional demeanor, knowing that any sign of resistance would eliminate whatever opportunities might present themselves. The truck slowed and turned off the main road onto a narrow trail that wound through dense forest. Joyce could see lights ahead through the trees, probably from the judge's cabin, and she realized that they were approaching the point where planning would give way to action. Quote 1042. Harrison said as the truck came to a stop. Joyce asked. Quote de Tarfagen, quote de front. The assignment was both an opportunity and a trap. Searching the judge's papers would give Joyce access to information about Harrison's criminal network, but it would also make her an active participant in the operation, rather than simply a passive observer. As they prepared to leave the truck, Joyce caught Marshall Davis's eye and saw her own determination reflected in his battered features. Whatever happened in the next hour, whatever choices they made, and whatever consequences they faced, they would not go down without a fight. The approach to the cabin was conducted with military precision, with guards positioning themselves around the perimeter, while Harrison led the primary team toward the front entrance. Joyce and Davis were escorted by 2 armed men who stayed close enough to prevent escape attempts, but far enough away to avoid being caught in crossfire if resistance developed. The cabin was larger than Joyce had expected, a well-built structure that suggested the judge had sufficient resources to live comfortably in his remote location. Lights were visible in several windows, and smoke rose from the chimney, indicating that the occupant was home and probably unaware of the danger approaching through the darkness. Harrison approached the front door with the confidence of someone who believed he controlled every aspect of the situation. His knock was polite but insistent, the sound of someone who expected to be admitted without question. "Judge Morrison," Harrison called out. "Colonel Harrison, Territorial Administration. I need to speak with you about some urgent legal matters." The response from inside the cabin was immediate and suspicious. "Colonel Harrison, I was not expecting any visitors tonight. Can this wait until morning?" "I'm afraid not, Your Honor. There have been some developments that require immediate attention, federal jurisdiction issues that could affect several of your recent rulings." Joyce could hear movement inside the cabin, the sound of someone approaching the door with understandable caution. Judge Morrison was clearly intelligent enough to be suspicious of unexpected visitors in such a remote location, but he was also apparently committed to his duties as a territorial official. "Do you have identification?" Morrison asked through the door. "Of course," Harrison replied, producing credentials that were probably genuine but being used for criminal purposes. "I also have Marshal Davis with me, if that helps establish our legitimacy." The mention of Davis was clearly intended to reassure the judge, but it also created an opportunity that Joyce had not anticipated. If Morrison knew Davis by reputation, if he trusted the federal marshal's presence as a guarantee of legitimacy, then Davis might be able to signal a warning without arousing immediate suspicion. The door opened to reveal a man in his 60s, tall and distinguished with silver hair, and the bearing of someone accustomed to authority. Judge Morrison was clearly intelligent and capable, which made the planned murder just even more tragic and senseless. Quote, 1054, Morrison said, extending his hand in greeting. Quote, shout, Davis stepped forward, his movement careful but deliberate. Quote, Joyce held her breath as she watched Davis navigate the crucial moment. If he could communicate the danger without alerting Harrison's men, if he could somehow warn Morrison about what was really happening, it might create opportunities for resistance or escape. "What kind of developments?" Morrison asked. His attention focused on Davis rather than Harrison. "The kind that require immediate relocation to a secure facility," Davis replied. "There have been threats made against officials who have been asking questions about certain mining operations." Harrison's expression tightened slightly, probably recognizing that Davis was deviating from the planned script. But the federal marshal's words were ambiguous enough that they could be interpreted as supporting the cover story rather than contradicting it. "Threats?" Morrison's voice carried alarm, but also skepticism. "Get down to 61. Quote on 62, Davis said, his eyes meeting Morrison's directly. "People who are willing to kill to protect their criminal enterprises." The warning was clear to anyone who understood the subtext, but Harrison was already moving to regain control of the situation. His hand moved toward his concealed weapon as he stepped closer to the judge. "What Marshal Davis means," Harrison said smoothly, "is that we have intelligence suggesting that certain radical elements might target territorial officials who have been involved in mining dispute rulings." But Judge Morrison was clearly intelligent enough to recognize the inconsistencies in what he was being told. His eyes moved from Harrison to Davis to the armed men who were now visible around his property, and Joyce could see understanding dawn in his expression. "I see," Morrison said quietly, "and you believe the best way to protect me is to remove me from my home in the middle of the night?" "It is a temporary precaution," Harrison replied, "until we can neutralize the specific threats that have been identified." Morrison nodded slowly, but Joyce could see that he was preparing for action rather than compliance. The judge's hand moved toward a coat rack near the door, where a gun belt hung within easy reach. Morrison said Harrison's patience was clearly at an end. His weapon cleared its holster with practiced speed as he abandoned any pretense of legitimate law enforcement activity. "I am afraid that is not an option, Your Honor," Harrison said, his voice carrying the cold finality of someone who had made his decision. But Judge Morrison was not the helpless victim that Harrison had expected. The older man's hand closed on the pistol at his belt with surprising speed, and suddenly the carefully planned assassination had become a deadly confrontation with an uncertain outcome. The first gunshot shattered the mountain silence like breaking glass, followed immediately by shouts and the sound of running feet as the situation spiraled beyond anyone's control. Joyce threw herself to the ground as bullets began flying, her mind racing through possibilities for escape or resistance in the chaos that was unfolding around them. The final battle for justice had begun, and its outcome would determine not just their own survival, but the fate of everyone who had dared to stand against Harrison's criminal empire. In the darkness and confusion of the firefight, Joyce Mitchell prepared to make her last stand against the forces of corruption that had already claimed too many innocent lives. The woman who had once been afraid of her own shadow was about to discover just how much courage she had gained during her long journey from victim to fighter. And in that discovery, she would find either redemption or death, but never again the paralysis of fear that had once defined her existence. The gunfire continued, echoing off the mountain walls like thunder, carrying with it the promise that whatever emerged from this night would be fundamentally different from what had existed before. Change was coming to the mountains, written in blood and gunpowder, and Joyce Mitchell would be one of its primary authors.